Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you might as well listen to this story, and maybe you will fall asleep soon. Before listening, please like and subscribe first. Of course, the premise is that you really like my content. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave a message below. Your opinions will really help me grow. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's get started. The tip of Aidan Hawke's pen poked a hole in the notebook. The air conditioning in the hotel on the outskirts of Melbourne made a shrill hum as he stared at the copy of the will on the table and counted the list of heirs for the third time. Lawyer, artist, prodigal son, illegitimate child, adopted daughter. 5 names were like 5 steel nails driven into the paper. The 4 words 7 days of cohabitation were circled 7 times by him with a red pen, and the ink turned into dark red thorns. The phone vibrated in my palm. It was old Fowler from the law firm. "Mr. Hawke, you should go to Blackthorn." The voice on the phone was whistling. "Edward's funeral has just ended, and the heirs are all here." Aidan pinched his brows. His last case at the FBI 3 years ago suddenly surfaced. The serial thief he profiled slit his wrists in the interrogation room, his confession stained with blood. "You always say there are no perfect accidents." Old Fowler's voice was like a needle. This time, even the autopsy report said, "accidental fall from a building." As he stuffed the will into his briefcase, the metal buckle scraped against the inside secret pocket. There lay a yellowed newspaper clipping with the headline, "FBI profiler mistakenly leads to suspect's death." It was dusk when the iron gate of Blackthorn Manor creaked shut behind him. Albert, the butler, took the briefcase with a hunched back, but his knuckles were as strong as iron pliers.
"Welcome, Mr. Hawke," he spoke in a Melbourne accent mixed with German. "The master always said that you are the best at finding hidden clues."
The right corner of the entrance carpet is lifted half an inch. As Aidan bent down to adjust it, his peripheral vision swept across the walnut bookcase against the wall. History of Gothic architecture was half pulled out, and the spine was 2 centimeters away from the other books. He reached out and pushed gently. The spine of the book fit perfectly, but when his fingertips touched the cover, he could smell a faint scent of sandalwood. This house was built in 1890. Albert's voice floated from behind. "The stones are soaked in stories." The oil painting at the corner of the stairs suddenly shook. Aidan looked up and saw that the screws on the picture frame were loosened half a turn. He took out a pen and wrote on his notebook, "The entrance carpet is misplaced, dragged by someone. History of Gothic architecture is abnormal. Has it been read recently? The oil painting screws are loose, frequently passed. Is this a shabby place suitable for living?" A shrill female voice burst into the corridor. The woman in the dark green velvet dress was swinging a platinum bag and had a leather anti-slip rope tied around her wrist. "Old Hawke's inheritance is enough for me to buy 10 glass-walled villas, but I chose to be trapped in this stone coffin for 7 days. Miss Lillian Finch." Albert bowed. "Your room is on the 3rd floor of the east wing." Finch. Aidan closed his notebook. The artist's last name in the will was Finch, and he remembered that Hawke's affair partner was also named Finch. The woman glanced at him and poked the anti-slip rope with her burgundy nail-polished fingers. "I just finished painting the sunrise on the rooftop terrace, and this broken railing is so slippery." When she turned around, the anti-slip rope rubbed against the back of Aidan's hand. The leather was a little hard. Was it newly replaced? "Mr. Hawke," another voice came from the stairs. The woman in the white coat was holding a medical kit, her eyes behind the lenses like deep pools. "Vivian Carter, Old Hawke's personal physician." She handed over a business card, her fingertips as cold as ice. "Are you here to investigate his death?" "You think it was an accident?" Vivian lowered her head and adjusted her cuffs. The autopsy report said there was a trace amount of muscle relaxant in his blood. She looked up and her glasses reflected the light, but the dose was not enough to be fatal. Dinner was served at a long oak table. The prodigal son didn't come. He was said to be sobering up in the wine cellar. The illegitimate son was still on the way. Lawyer George Brenner pushed his gold-rimmed glasses and jingled his silver forks. On the 7th day, I will read out the final terms in front of everyone. Aidan noticed that George's cuffs were stained with sawdust and there was a fresh scratch on the pinky finger of his right hand. He added a note in his notebook. Lawyer has recently come into contact with wooden tools carving, repair. Too late. I'm going to the study to find some information. When Aidan stood up, Albert just brought the dessert. There was a fine scratch on the edge of the silver plate, the same position as the scratch on the pocket watch he helped the butler find 10 years ago. The study is at the westernmost end of the 2nd floor. The walnut book wall stretched from the floor to the ceiling. When Aidan was standing on tiptoe to read History of Australian Land Titles, he heard a muffled bang sound coming from above his head. He rushed out the door and saw the wall lamp in the corridor on the 2nd floor was shaking. There was a greasy spot in the middle of the handrail. He touched it and found it was olive oil, the same lubricant as the one used on the stairs when Old Hawk fell. Footprint. The footprints from the 3rd floor terrace to the stairs had deep impressions on the forefoot and shallow impressions on the heel, as if they were left by someone stumbling after being pushed. But the footprints in the front row had the left foot 3 centimeters away from the right foot, as if someone was walking backwards. My temples began to throb. This is the signal that soul power is activated. Aidan closed his eyes. The smell of rust floated in the air. Not blood, but the smell of metal friction. He saw the scene. In the moonlight, a figure fell from the 3rd floor terrace, and there was no one at the stairs below. But the oil stains on the armrest glowed in the moonlight, like a poisonous snake. It wasn't an accident. He opened his eyes, cold sweat soaking his shirt. The pool of blood from 3 years ago suddenly overlapped with the oil stain in front of him. He clenched the notebook tightly, and the pages made a rustling protest. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Aidan tossed and turned in the guest room. There was a slight friction sound coming from outside the window, like someone was pushing something heavy. He put on his clothes and went downstairs. When he passed the library, a ray of light came through the crack in the door. The door is not locked. He pushed open the door, and moonlight slanted in from the high window, shining on the revolving bookshelf. The Bible on the bottom shelf was half fallen over, revealing the secret compartment at the back. He reached out to touch it, and just as his fingertips touched the spine of the book, there was a sudden thud of something heavy falling to the ground downstairs. As Aidan rushed downstairs, Albert came out of the kitchen holding a candlestick, with wet marks on the hem of his nightgown. Maybe the bottles in the wine cellar fell over. The butler's voice was hoarse than during the day. You should rest, Mr. Hawke. Back in the room, Aidan opened his notebook and wrote murder in the column, cause of death of Old Hawk. When he closed the notebook, a photo slipped from the inside page. The suspect who committed suicide 3 years ago was smiling like a child in front of the camera. Outside the window, the blackthorn bushes rustled. At 6 in the morning, a sharp scream pierced the morning mist. When Aidan grabbed his coat and rushed downstairs, Albert was standing at the door of the library, the candlestick in his hand shaking.
Mr. George,
The butler's Adam's apple rolled. He was crushed by the bookshelf. Aidan squeezed through the door. The revolving bookshelf was tilted on the ground, and George Brenner's body was stuck between the bookshelf and the wall. His gold-rimmed glasses were broken at his feet, and his right hand was still clutching half a yellowed piece of paper. It was a title deed from... He squatted down and saw that the sawdust on George's cuffs was mixed with red fibers, the same material as Lillian's anti-slip rope. The oil stains on the stair railing were still there, glowing dark yellow in the morning light. Aidan touched the pen in his pocket, the tip of the pen pressed against his palm, and the pain made him sober. Soul power started beating again. This time, the scene he saw was a revolving bookshelf turning slowly, and there were two hands pushing it, with sawdust on the cuffs and fresh scratches on the fingertips. Was it George himself? The scene flashes back. On the night that old Hawk fell from the building, there were hands applying the lubricant to the stairs. When the artist's anti-slip rope was replaced, there were hands untying the old rope. On the night that the swimming pool drain was blocked, there were hands tightening the screws. The hands in all the images are very similar. The knuckles are thick, and the joints have calluses from years of holding tools. Aidan looked up and saw Albert wiping the candlestick with his back to him. The butler's hands were pale blue in the morning mist, and the calluses on his knuckles were clearly visible. "Breakfast is ready." Albert turned around with a humble smile on his face. "Mr. Hawk, would you like some coffee?" Aidan took out a pen and wrote on the latest page of his notebook. Suspect characteristics. Familiar with the structure of the estate, with access to slip agents, anti-slip ropes, and swimming pool drains. Motives. Old grudges with old Hawk. Key clues. The revolving bookshelf in the library, the title deed from 1995, and Albert's hand. Outside the window, blackthorn bushes swayed in the wind, like countless open hands. Aidan was staring at the blackthorns on the windowsill when the scream pierced the morning mist. His hand grabbing the coat paused. The scream was like a rusty knife, stabbing directly into his nerves. When I rushed to the corner of the second floor, I saw Albert holding the door frame of the library, and the candlesticks were emitting dim light in the morning mist. Mr. George. The inside of the library was in a mess. The revolving bookshelf leaned against the wall, and the wooden frame pressed against George's chest. The gold-rimmed glasses broke into pieces and stuck to his pale grey cheeks. In his right hand he still held half a title deed, the edges of which were tinged with the old yellow of... Aidan squatted down. The track at the bottom of the bookshelf was tilted half an inch as if someone had pushed it hard.
Among the scattered War and Peace and Faust on the ground, there was a piece of white paper that was particularly clean. The two words "suicide note" were stained with ink, lying next to George's left hand, and even the creases were not messed up.
Who discovered it first? His fingertips tightened around the pen. "Miss Lillian." Albert's voice was hoarse. "She passed by while jogging in the morning and called me." The hem of the housekeeper's nightgown was stained with coffee, and his knuckles were against the door frame, and the calluses on his knuckles were bluish-white. Aidan's soul power began to jump. In the picture, the revolving bookshelf was turning slowly. George's hands were on the wooden axis, and his sleeves were rubbed against sawdust. But the next second, the bookshelf suddenly tilted. He rushed over to help it, but was pressed underneath. "Did anyone enter the library last night?" He stared into Albert's eyes. "No one." The housekeeper lowered his eyes. "I checked all the doors and windows before going to bed." "Ma'am," Aidan said suddenly. Albert's Adam's apple rolled, and he uttered in German between his teeth, "They owe her." There was a hole in the notebook, poked by the pen tip. Aidan drew 3 exclamation marks next to the word German. When looking for the pocket watch 10 years ago, the butler had said, "Madam's favorite rose," which was also German. When the sun climbed above the roof, he slipped into the library again. There is a thin scratch on the back of the bookshelf, running diagonally from the top to the bottom, and it doesn't match the groove on the ground at all. He tried to push it, to make a 2-meter-high bookshelf tilt like this. At least 2 people would need to push from both sides. But all that was left of the scene was the print of George's leather shoes, with the heel stuck in the gap between the tracks, like a cockroach that had been crushed to death. I ran into Vivian on my way back to the guest room. She held the medicine box, her white coat pockets bulging. "Do an autopsy on George." Aidan wanted to follow, but she slipped him a note. The edges of the paper were frayed, and the words were typed. "Don't believe the marks on the body. Who gave it to you?" She shook her head, the ends of her hair brushing the back of his hand. Maybe it was the wind. When she turned around, the buckle of the medicine box was not closed tightly, and a small medicine bottle fell out. The words muscle relaxant on the label were quickly covered by her fingernail. At 11 o'clock in the evening, Aidan spread out the blueprint in the study. The tip of the pencil moved along the track of the library and suddenly stopped. The deed in George's hand and the Bible in the secret compartment of the attic were both dated. Was the land that old Hawk seized related to this? There was a click sound coming from the direction of the wellhead. He grabbed a pen and rushed out. The wooden door of the hut beside the well was ajar, and the moonlight leaked in, illuminating a half rope wrapped around the edge of the well. The red knot still had body temperature, and the broken end was neat, as if it had been cut by a knife. The color was exactly the same as the anti-slip rope that Lillian wore on her wrist yesterday. Aidan squatted down. The rope was covered in mud and some rust. There was a sound of dripping water coming from the well, dong dong, like someone knocking on a coffin. He took out his cell phone to shine a light and suddenly heard the sound of water coming from the direction of the swimming pool. It's not ripples caused by the wind, but the muffled sound of someone flapping his wings. When he ran over, the moonlight only illuminated the slippers by the swimming pool. The water ripples spread out in circles, casting swaying shadows on the tiles. "Charlie," he called. No one answered. The wind blew the thorns of black thorns across his ankles, and goosebumps appeared on the back of Aidan's neck. He bent down and picked up his slippers, a pair of crocodile-patterned leather shoes, the heels stained with chlorine and some water droplets that had not yet been wiped off. The notebook was turned to a new page. He wrote, "The red rope at the wellhead was broken, suspected to be man-made. Unusual water noises near the swimming pool." Charlie's shoes. As the pen tip pierced the paper, the black thorn bush outside the window suddenly shook violently. Something rushed through the branches and leaves, bringing with it a suppressed groan. Aidan grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. The moonlight stretched the shadow very long, like a rope around the neck. He ran through the rose garden, past the fountain, and finally stopped by the swimming pool. The water was silvery, and there was nothing there, but he knows tonight has just begun. At 5 in the morning, Aidan was awakened by screams. He grabbed his coat and rushed downstairs where a circle of people gathered by the pool. Lillian squatted on the ground and trembled, poking her fingers into the water. Charlie Hawk was floating face down, his white shirt soaked with water, like a ball of rotten cotton wool. Aidan jumped into the pool and felt Charlie's wrist when the water reached his chest. Cold, no pulse. He turned the man over. His eyes were bulging, and his hands were tightly gripping the iron mesh of the drain. There was rust stuck in the gaps between his fingernails. "Stand back." He stopped the people who were about to come over and squatted by the pool to check the drain. The metal mesh was welded tightly, with fresh scratches on the edges. This kind of sealing method would never be used for normal maintenance, and it couldn't be opened even with a wrench. The poolside slippers were crooked in the cracks between the tiles. The toe of the left shoe points outward 30 degrees, and the right foot presses on the left heel. Aidan took out a pen and wrote on the notebook. "When struggling, it kicks around. This angle is wrong. It looks like someone has set it up." "Rope." Lillian suddenly pulled his sleeve. "Last night, someone sent the rope back to me." She took out a red rope from her painting bag. The broken end was neatly broken, and the end was covered in mud. "Someone knocked on my door in the middle of the night and slipped a note." She shook out a crumpled piece of paper. It said, "Found your things." Aidan held the note up to the light. The handwriting was crooked, and it was exactly the same as the handwriting of the suicide note that George left at the scene of his fall. Both were deliberately imitated left-handed writing. "Who can enter the manor?" "Only the housekeeper." Lillian's voice trembled. "Albert said that all visitors must register." As Aidan turned around, he knocked over a plastic bucket by the pool. Chlorine water splashed on the back of his feet. He stared at the iron door of the equipment room. Half a wire was inserted in the keyhole. The basement smelled musty. He walked along the wall in the dark, and his fingertips touched a piece of freshly painted white lime. 2 shades lighter than the surrounding area. With a strong push, the wall cracked with a click. Behind the secret door was a narrow passage, water seeping from the cracks in the wall, and the moss was so slippery that people could not walk steadily. Aidan took out his cell phone to illuminate the floor. There was half a shoe print on the floor tile, a size 42 with the same pattern as the shoe print at the scene where George fell from the building. "Mr. Hawke?" Albert's voice exploded from behind. Aidan turned around and saw the old man holding a tea tray, with steam blurring his glasses. Lemon tea made in the early morning warms the stomach. When the cup was handed to him, Aidan caught a glimpse of the other person's hand. The knuckles were as thick as walnuts. The palms were thickly calloused, and there was sawdust on the edges, like a hand that has long held a hammer. "Thank you." He took a sip of his tea, which tasted bitterly sweet. "How many years have you been at the manor?" 33 years. Albert polished the silver spoon. "Older than some of the heirs." At 10 o'clock in the evening, the old clock in the attic struck 10. Aidan flipped through the account book from 1995, and the moldy dust made him sneeze. A receipt was tucked into one of the pages. "Accidental death benefit. Payee Albert Crane. $50,000 Australian dollars." His hand holding the receipt paused. Were the people that old Hawke forced to death were Albert's wife and children. Footsteps came from the stairs. Aidan quickly blew out the lamp and shrank behind the oak cabinet. The moonlight leaked in, illuminating a hunched shadow. Albert was holding a shovel, his heels tapping on the floor, and the shovel head was covered with fresh mud. Shadow stopped in front of the account book and turned his skinny fingers to the page Aidan had just read. Aidan held his breath and smelled a rusty smell. "Blood. It's time to end it," Albert murmured, put the shovel closer to his arms, turned around and went downstairs. Aidan wrote down the last line in the dark. "Drainage system maintenance record. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. He stared out the window at the whitening skyline, his knuckles pinched until they ached. There is something behind the secret door in the basement that has not been discovered. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Aidan stared at the drainage system maintenance record at the head of his bed. The ink glowed coldly in the morning light. He held the pen and drew 3 horizontal lines under the words "tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. This was the last schedule revised by old Hawke, and it was also the best time for him to sneak into the basement. He pulled on his rubber boots and fished out the keys he had taken from the equipment room the night before. When he went downstairs, he ran into Albert, who was holding a silver tray. The old man had swollen eyelids and dust in the corners of his eyes. Mr. Hawke got up early. "Check the drainage." Aidan shook the inspection list in his hand. "The lawyer said that, for safety reasons, I have to keep an eye on it." Albert's fingers left white marks on the edge of the tray, and after a moment he forced a smile. "It should be. The key to the equipment room is on the door lintel. I just dusted it off." When the iron door of the equipment room creaked open, Aidan's heel crushed a piece of sawdust, the same sawdust pattern as the one on Albert's palm last night. He bent down to pick it up, put it in his trouser pocket, and felt his way along the damp wall to the secret door. A piece of the newly applied white lime was rubbed off by my fingertips, revealing the mottled cracks in the bricks underneath. The secret passage was darker than last night, and water like ice chips was seeping from the cracks in the wall. Aidan walked close to the wall, and the light from his phone illuminated half a shoe print on the floor tile, a size 42, which was exactly the same as the one at the scene where George fell from the building. After walking 7 steps, the musty smell suddenly became stronger. He looked up and saw thorn flowers coiled on the rusty iron gate. The thorns were clearly visible, exactly the same as the code word "use thorn flowers as a guide" in the will. The iron door hinges screamed in their death throes. Aidan hunched his shoulders and squeezed in, and the moldy dust fell on his head. There were more than a dozen photo albums piled on the oak table in the middle. The top photo was yellowed. A woman in a floral dress was holding a baby standing in front of the manor, and behind her stood Albert in a suit, looking so young that he was almost unrecognizable. The second photo made him breathless. The woman was hanging on an old locust tree. Her skirt was blown up by the wind, and the baby was curled up at her feet, his little face turning purple. On the back of the photo was written in crooked pen, "They owe her." Aiden took out his cell phone to take a photo. Just as he was pointing the camera at the third photo, he heard dragging footsteps outside the door. He instinctively slipped into the closet, and in the gap between the closet doors, Albert's shadow was stretched long by the moonlight. The old man held a shovel in his hand, his heels tapping on the ground, and the muddy toes of his shoes were pointing right at where he had just stood. "Ma'am," Albert's voice was like sandpaper cleaning glass. The lawyer's bones were completely broken, and Charlie was still holding the stone I stuffed in when he sank to the bottom of the pool. He took out a photo from his pocket and slapped it on the table. It was Charlie, the prodigal who drowned last night, his face swollen and pale. Next, the old man's Adam's apple rolled. It's the accomplice's turn. The shovel hit the door frame, and the footsteps faded away. Aiden waited for 10 minutes, until he was sure that there was no movement downstairs. Then he crouched down and climbed out of the dark room. He stored the photos in an encrypted cloud drive and scribbled in his notebook. Albert's targets were those involved in the 1995 incident, including the lawyer who forged the title deed, Charlie, the instigator, the artist, but Lillian's mother is a woman's best friend. In the evening, the smell of oil paint in the studio was so choking that people couldn't open their eyes. Lillian swung her paintbrush, and the color on the canvas looked like a bowl of blood. "You mean the woman in the photo?" Her hands suddenly trembled, and the paint dripped at her feet. "My mother mentioned that she had a best friend who died in this manner 30 years ago. Your mother is now." "She died 10 years ago." Lillian pulled off her paint-stained gloves, her knuckles turning white. "Before she died, she said that the person who killed her friend had a black thorn in his name." The tip of Aiden's pen punctured the notebook paper. He stared at the red corners of Lillian's eyes. The shape of her eyes was exactly the same as the woman in the photo. It turns out that she is the illegitimate daughter of Old Hawk and the woman's best friend. She is not on Albert's revenge list at all. She is just an accident caused by blood relationship. At 11 o'clock in the evening, Aiden was burning his note in front of the fireplace. As sparks flew up, he smelled a burning smell, not of wood, but of burnt cloth. He opened the window, and the wind blew in with the smell of cigarette smoke. Following the smell, I saw a strange red light coming from the window of the library, like a pair of bloodshot eyes. He grabbed his coat and rushed downstairs, and the oil painting at the corner of the stairs suddenly fell to the ground with a clang. The frame cracked, revealing half a sheet of paper hidden inside. It was the draft of Old Hawk's revised will. The last sentence was circled 3 times in red pen. "Before the 7th day is up, the thorns will bloom." The smell of smoke became stronger. Aiden's shoe crushed something and he bent down to pick it up. It was a half-burned match that still smelled of turpentine. Thick smoke filled into the guest room at 5:30 in the morning. When Aiden woke up from choking, the pillow was already covered in dust. He kicked off the blanket and rushed to open the window. Charles screamed downstairs. "The library is on fire." The corridor was full of people running around. Lillian wrapped herself in her nightgown and poured cold water on her head. Vivian grabbed the medicine box and pushed his shoulder away. "The fire extinguisher is on the 1st floor." Aiden ran downstairs against the flow of people. The heat wave from the fire surged up from the stairs. The oak door of the library was emitting black smoke, and the flames coming out of the gap in the door licked the door frame. "Keys." He grabbed Albert's sleeve. The old butler's hands were shaking, and the keychain fell to the ground with a clatter. Aiden bent down to pick it up, and out of the corner of his eye he saw fresh turpentine stains on the soles of the old man's shoes. Exactly the same smell as the matchstick from last night. The moment he kicked open the door of the library, the heat wave lifted his collar. The bookshelves were burning, and the cover of the replica of the Magna Carta was curled up into black butterflies, spinning in the air. Aidan rushed into the inner room with his back bent. Old Hawk's desk was still in the corner. He took off his coat and put out the flames on the table, then pulled out a tin box from the bottom of the drawer. It contained a backup of the photos taken in the dark room the night before. "Go," Vivian shouted at the door. "The second floor is going to collapse." Aidan rushed out, grabbing the tin box, and a burning wooden board hit his feet. As he staggered, he caught a glimpse of a charred piece of paper on the ground with half a bloody fingerprint stuck on the edge. He squatted down and picked up the ashes. The crooked words landed on the piece of paper, pierced his eyes. The handwriting was the same as the forged document in Lawyer Mason's office, as if it was written by the same person. When the fire truck arrived, only a charred frame was left of the library. Albert squatted at the edge of the ruins, searching for something with a shovel, his white hair becoming brittle from the smoke. Lillian trembled while holding the wet canvas, paint dripping from her fingers onto the ground like a pool of solidified blood. The track wasn't burned through. Aidan squatted in front of the remains of the bookshelf. The copper track originally embedded in the ground had burn marks, but the pulley at the bottom could still rotate. He took out a pen and started drawing on his notebook, but suddenly stopped halfway through. A half-broken hemp rope was stuck in the drawstring groove, with dark red wax on the end. Turpentine helps the fire, and the wax fixes the rope. He looked at the rope in the sunlight. Someone tied the bookshelf and the rope together in advance. Once the fire burns the wax, the bookshelf will turn on its own. "Turn?" Charles shrank his neck and came closer. "Where to turn?" Aidan didn't answer. He walked in the direction of the rope to the east wing. A piece of the wall of the abandoned storage room had fallen off, revealing half a loose brick. He pressed with his fingertips, and the whole wall made a click sound, and slowly opened to both sides. The musty smell in the secret passage poured out, and on the other side of the wall was the back of the bookshelf in the library. Albert cleans the library every day. He touched the cracks in the bricks of the wall. He knows there is a secret passage here. He knows how to make the bookshelves rotate when the fire starts, so as to crush the lawyer's body even more. The rain in the evening came suddenly. Aidan was drying his hair in Vivian's office, leaving watermarks all over the glass. The doctor handed over the hot cocoa, but he pulled his hand back because the metal cup was so hot.
Old Hawk's blood sample. She opened the drawer and took out a yellowed test report. Muscle relaxant. The dosage is just enough to make him unsteady, but the source cannot be found. You didn't report it. Aidan stared at the signature on the report. My mother was his nurse. Vivian dug her nails into her palms. Before she died, she said, "I have a father in Melbourne. I searched for 10 years until I saw Old Hawk's case." She suddenly laughed. How ridiculous! In order to confirm the blood relationship, I helped the murderer conceal the real cause of death. The thunder outside the window drowned out her last words. Aidan put the report into the tin box, and when he turned around he caught a glimpse of the red in Vivian's eyes. They looked very much like the eyes of the housekeeper's deceased wife in the darkroom photograph. At 11 o'clock in the evening, Aidan was sorting out clues in the study. Moonlight filtered in through the blinds, casting a fence-like shadow on the notebook. He had just written down secret passage, Albert chain of revenge. When a dark shadow suddenly flashed outside the window, he grabbed his pen and rushed out, with only a draft in the corridor. On the doormat lay a brown paper envelope. The words on the cover were typed. "You are so smart, Mr. Aidan." The signature was a thorn flower drawn in red ink, and there were watermarks on the edges of the petals, as if it had been rained on before it dried. He returned to the study, holding the envelope, and the moment the match was lit, the flame illuminated the corner of the envelope. It was covered with fresh mud, the same color as the mud on the soles of Albert's shoes when he was putting out the fire this morning. When the alarm went off in the early morning of the 7th day, Aidan stared out the window at the blackthorn bush. The rain blew the petals all over the ground, as if someone had spilled blood. Lillian screamed from downstairs. He grabbed his coat and rushed out. In the mirror at the corner of the stairs, the
3 blurry shadows were reflected. Him, Lillian, and Vivian. In Albert's room, the door was ajar, and the bed sheets had not been touched all night. The scream in the early morning of the 7th day was like an icicle piercing the back of Aiden's neck. As he rushed down the stairs, his leather heels made a crisp sound on the marble steps. Lillian huddled at the corner of the stairs, her fingers shaking so much that she couldn't poke the phone screen accurately. Albert's bed, the sheets are flat. Vivian leaned over the railing from the 2nd floor and said, "I checked the room at 3 in the morning, and his door was still locked." Aiden leaned over and felt the mattress. The sheets were wrinkle-free, and the pillowcases even had starched edges. He didn't sleep at all last night. He straightened up and glanced at the 2 pale faces. The 7th night is the deadline for the will. Lillian's eyelashes trembled like a butterfly wet by the rain. "You mean, he's going to take action? We're not going to do it." Aiden pulled out a pen from his coat pocket and tapped it twice on the stair railing. "We're already preparing." He stared at the silver chain dangling around Lillian's neck. It was the one she had put on the dummy's neck this morning. "So we have to give him a chance." 3 people crowded in the kitchen. Vivian poured instant coffee into the mug, and the metal spoon made a harsh sound. "You want Lillian as bait?" When she looked up, her pupils behind her glasses shrank to pinpoints. "If he really wants to do that, what he wants is an accident." Aiden loosened his tie. The first 4 were disguised as accidents, and the last one will be no exception. He turned to Lillian. "You only need to hide in the attic for 2 hours, and wait for me to catch you in the act." Lillian bit her nails painted with rose-colored lip glaze and said, "What about the dummy?" "I put your nightgown on the model." Aiden pointed to the outline covered with white cloth in the corner of the restaurant. "The hair is your wig, and the necklace is the one you picked this morning." He knocked on the dining table. "The key is—" "I know." Lillian suddenly put down the coffee cup heavily, and the brown liquid splashed on the tablecloth. "I have to make Albert think that I really hid in the attic, and then he will follow in and you can catch him." She sniffed. "But what if he has a gun?" Vivian suddenly held her hand. The doctor's fingers were cold, but steady. "I have some adrenaline in the clinic." She looked at Aiden. "What do you need me to do?" "You stay on the 1st floor." Aiden took out a mini intercom from his pocket. "Call the police when you hear the bell ring." He pointed outside the window. "There is a bell tied to the wire at the entrance of the secret passage. Albert has to pass through there to get to the attic." The rain stopped in the evening. Aiden squatted in the storage room of the east wing, adjusting the wire with the help of the flashlight on his cell phone. The sound of the wire rubbing against the cracks in the bricks was like a snake spitting out its tongue. He tied the bell 30 centimeters above the ground. Albert, with his hunched back, would just touch it. The musty smell in the attic is stronger than during the day. He stuffed the mannequin into the corner, covered its face with Lillian's red scarf, and scattered a few handfuls of charcoal shavings on the floor. Lillian always said that abstract paintings require original traces. Finally, he pressed a note on the windowsill, with his handwriting imitating Lillian's cursive writing. "Albert knows the secret passage. I'm hiding in the attic. It's 12:17 midnight." Aiden was leaning against the wall of the secret passage when the crisp sound of a bell pierced the silence. The musty smell was mixed with the smell of damp earth, the same smell as the mud on the soles of Albert's shoes this morning. He took out a pen, unscrewed the cap, and revealed the miniature recorder hidden inside. He counted to the 3rd click when the wooden attic door creaked on its hinges. "Lillian?" Albert's voice was like sandpaper scraping against iron. "I know you are here." Aiden clenched his pen and pushed the door open. The draft lifted the mannequin's nightgown. Albert had his back to the door, the gun in his hand pointed at the corner. He had been cleaning that gun for 30 years, and the barrel gleamed coldly in the moonlight. "Stop." Aiden's voice was like ice. Albert turned slowly. He straightened his hunched back, and sweat seeped through the wrinkles on his face. "You're faster than I thought." "Not fast. Aiden held up the recorder. You pushed the lawyer's bookshelf. You knew the secret passage could turn the bookshelf. You replaced the artist's anti-slip rope. You stole the spare rope from her studio. You blocked the drain of the prodigal son's swimming pool. You put cement blocks there when he was drunk. He took a step forward, including Old Hawk's fall. You applied the slippery agent on the stairs, right? Albert's fingers twitched on the gun handle. So what? He chuckled in German. They owed it to my wife. So you spent 30 years waiting for these 7 days. Aiden pressed the record button, and a vague voice saying, "They owed her" came from the German audio. "I found the recording you made back then in the old phonograph in the library." Albert's gun shook. The moonlight shone on his face, and he suddenly smiled. "Do you think you are a hero? You were so righteous when you misjudged that car thief 10 years ago, and he committed suicide in the interrogation room." Aiden's temple was throbbing. He took out his notebook and turned to the page with the secret passage map. "But I didn't misjudge this time." He pointed at the dummy. "Lillian is on the first floor with Vivian." Suddenly sirens sounded downstairs. Albert's shoulders slumped. He put the gun on the floor, and the sound of metal clanging startled the crows outside the window. "I should have thought of that." He stared at Aiden's pen. "You always use this to write down clues." Albert did not resist when the police rushed in. As he passed by Aiden, he whispered, "When the day comes when you realize that justice can't save everyone." His voice was cut off by the sound of sirens. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the manor returned to silence. Aiden stood in the attic, and the mannequin's red scarf was blown to the windowsill by the wind. He bent down and picked up the gun left by Albert. On the inside of the barrel was engraved 1995-20, the day when the housekeeper's wife and children committed suicide. The sky outside the window was turning pale. As Aiden stuffed the notebook into his suitcase, a photo slid out from the compartment. It was a photo of Old Hawk in the dark room, with a blurry figure in the background. It looked very much like young Vivian. He squatted down and ran his fingertips along the edge of the photo. The attic floor suddenly made a click sound, and a piece of wood lifted up, revealing a diary underneath. The words on the cover had faded. "To my unborn child." The morning light shone through the stained glass window onto the diary. Aiden's fingers hovered over the cover, but he didn't open it. He heard footsteps downstairs. At 5:17 in the morning, Aiden's leather heels clicked on the attic floor. After the police took Albert away, he did not return to the guest room. The brass lamp still stood on the oak table, and the edge of the lampshade was stained with Albert's fingerprints. The fingertips had left shallow marks on the metal when he raised the gun half an hour ago. The drawer was discovered when I bent over to pick up a pen. The pen slipped from the inside pocket of his suit and rolled under the table. He squatted down to reach it, and his fingertips touched the bulge in the gap between the wooden boards. With a push, the drawer popped open with a click. The cover of the diary rubbed off a thin layer of skin on his palm. The edges of the worn craft paper were curled and rough, and the words "To my dear Isabel" on the title page were blurred by ink, as if soaked in tears. He turned the page. On March 12, 1993, Albert's handwriting was still in neat round letters. Madame said she wanted to take little Carl to see the sea. I cleaned her blue skirt. The hem of her skirt was stained with mud from when I was trimming the roses. She laughed at me for being clumsy. The page dated May 20, 1995 was badly wrinkled. Aiden ran his thumb over the crease and saw the crooked handwriting. They said Carl stole the deed. The wife knelt in Hawk's office and said that her son was only 7 years old and couldn't even hold a pen steadily. Hawk patted her shoulder and said, "The evidence is collusive," then turned and winked at his assistant, the young man in the grey suit. I later learned that he was the city councilor's secretary. The next page was soaked with tears. Before she slit her wrists in the bathroom, I heard her shouting my name. She was still smiling when she pushed open the door, and her blood stained the tiles into red roses. She said, Don't let them win. Not save me, but don't let them win. Aiden's back teeth were sore from biting his teeth. He took out his cell phone and quickly dialed Charles' number. Mr. Mason. When the call was connected, he heard the other party swallowing his saliva. In the 1995 forged deed case, besides Edward Hawke, were there other signatories? There was silence for 10 seconds. Alderman. Charles' voice was like a trapped mouse. Mr. Hawke said that he and the alderman have been friends for 35 years. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the smell of oil paint in the studio made Lillian frown. She pulled off the dust sheet from the canvas, and the painting thorns and roses at the bottom suddenly fell down. When I reached out to help, the edge of the lining cloth got caught on a nail of the picture frame and was torn open with a swish sound. The photo fell at her feet. Isabel was wearing a light blue dress. The baby in her arms was wrapped in a beige swaddling cloth, and behind her stood a man in a three-piece suit. He was the city councilman who donated a building to the orphanage in the news last year. This woman is my mother's best friend. When Lillian rushed into the living room holding the photo, Aiden was flipping through the old account books. My mother said before she died that on the day Isabel died, a man wearing gold-rimmed glasses came to the manor. The ink on page 17 of the account book has become brittle. Aiden picked up the yellowed paper with the tip of his pen. In the signature column for accidental death compensation, in addition to Edward Hawke's cursive signature, there was also a line of neatly printed words. Robert Turner, the full name of the city councilor. The phone vibrates at this moment. Local news pop-up. City Councilman Turner attended a charity dinner and called for attention to children's rights. The man in the photo was wearing a silver-gray bow tie and holding a red wine glass with a gentle smile. As dusk drifted into the manor, Aiden sat in the ruins. A charred oak beam lay askew at my feet, having collapsed when the fire in the video game room had broken out 3 days earlier. He opened his notebook and saw 2 names drawn on the latest page, Albert Crane and Robert Turner. You haven't finished talking about the debt yet, he whispered to the wind. The blackthorn flowers in the distance rustled, as if someone was whispering in response. As the moonlight climbed up the bell tower, he closed his notebook and saved the screenshots of the city councilor's news in his cell phone album. The blue light of the screen reflected the dark circles under his eyes. His finger hovered over the link of Municipal Archives reservation. He paused for 2 seconds and pressed confirm. Tomorrow, he thought. I should check Robert Turner's schedule for May 19th. Aiden's alarm went off at 5:30. He stared at the swaying shadows of the trees on the ceiling and touched the pen on the bedside table. The pen cap was still stained with burnt sawdust from yesterday's rubbish in the ruins. Charles called at 7 o'clock. Area A, Row 3, Shelf 7, File number 995, 04127. The young man's voice was deliberately anxious. I looked through the Hawke law firm's 30 years of records last night. The original file of the land deed case should be there. The cold air in the city archives made the back of my neck feel cold. Aiden put on white gloves and his leather heels made a rapid drum beat as he moved between the metal filing racks. There are 7 shelves in 3 rows in Area A. The brown paper file boxes on the bottom shelf are covered with a thin layer of dust, and the numbers on the cover are exactly the same as Charles said. He pulled out the yellowed case file, the first page of which was a land ownership investigation report from Maine. Fingerprint identification, witness statements, and copies of land deeds were unfolded one by one, until page 1D, where the 3-party signature page should have been pasted. Half of the page was neatly cut off by a paper cutter. The city council member's signature is missing. Aiden's thumb stroked the rough edge of the cut. There were still light gray pen marks on the edge of the copy. Someone was afraid that his name would be seen. The retired judge's apartment is in the old town. The doorbell rang 3 times, and the sound of a cane hitting the ground was heard from behind the door. The old man who opened the door had neatly combed white hair. but his eyes behind the glasses seemed to be hardened by ice. A detective from the Hawk family. There were teacups on the coffee table in the living room, and half a faded judicial badge was sunk on the celadon bottom. Aidan handed over the photo he had taken from the archives. The old man paused on the incision. It's been 30 years, and the scar is still there. He stood up and took out a metal box, pulling out a stack of handwritten memos with tea stains on the edges of the pages. Back then, someone brought a briefcase into the court and said, "This case affects municipal planning." Who? Roland Beck. The old man turned to the last page of the memorandum. There is only one person who doesn't believe in evil. He pulled out an unsealed letter with curled corners. It's written by Albert, the butler, saying that he will go to the newspaper to expose it. The letter began in German. To the editor of the Melbourne Herald. Aidan scanned the scene quickly, his breathing becoming increasingly rapid. Albert recorded in detail the abnormalities that occurred before Isabel and her son committed suicide. He mentioned that the man with gold-rimmed glasses visited the estate at night for 3 consecutive days, and that a third hand pressed the red mud seal when the deed was signed. He didn't send it. The old man sighed. The next day, at Isabel's funeral, Baker's car was parked in front of the church. It was raining in Blackthorn Manor in the evening. When Aidan pushed open the door, Vivian was standing in front of the fireplace in the study, with half a medical record sticking out of the pocket of her white coat. I checked Old Hawk's medical aid records. She pulled out a yellowed test report. In 1994, Baker's son was diagnosed with progressive muscular dystrophy, and Old Hawk started the Neurological Disease Research Fund in the same year. Exchange of interests. Aidan held Albert's letter in his hand. Baker used his political resources to help Old Hawk grab land, and Old Hawk used money to save his son. More than that. Vivian pointed to the signature at the end of the report. I looked it up in the old hospital system and found that Albert's wife was the nurse back then. A week before her death, she changed the medicine for Baker's son. The study door was slammed open. Lillian's curly hair was dripping with rain, and she was holding an old-fashioned video recorder in her arms. I found it in the cracks of the studio floor. She pressed the play button, and a blurry picture popped up behind the snowy screen. Isabel was sitting in a rocking chair with bruises on her face. "If I die, please tell the world who left me with no way to escape." The screen flashed and cut to the manor's living room. Edward Hawke held up a glass of red wine, and sat opposite him was a man wearing gold-rimmed glasses. Roland Baker, who was at the charity dinner in the news. "The deed will be processed tomorrow." Hawke laughed harshly. "The mother and son, when they have had enough of the fuss, they will naturally understand what it means to know the current situation." Baker raised his glass and said, "I will record Mr. Hawke's generosity in the municipal planning case." The videotape jammed. Aidan took out his cell phone and took pictures of the video content, the cut photos from the archives, and Albert's letter in turn. As he packed all the files into the encrypted cloud drive, the sound of a car engine came from outside the window. The iron gate of the manor slowly opened. The black sedan rolled over the gravel road and stopped 3 steps away from him. The car window was lowered, and Roland Baker's silver-gray bow tie shone coldly in the rain. "Mr. Hawke, I heard that you have been investigating an old case recently." Aidan put his phone in his inner pocket. "Find the truth." "Some truths." Baker tapped the car door with his fingers. "Will keep a lot of people awake at night." He pulled out a checkbook from his suit pocket. "Name a price, and I'll give you whatever you want." "You can't give me what I want." Aidan took a half step back, and the rain dripped down the brim of his hat onto his leather shoes. "It's Isabel who wants it. It's Albert who wants it." Baker's smile froze on his face. He stared at the lighted window behind Aidan. Vivian was standing on the 2nd floor, clutching the medical report. Lillian was holding up the video camera. The lens pointed at the license plate of the car. "Young man," he said finally before rolling up the window, "you're going to regret this." After the car drove away, Aidan took out a pen. and circled the last page of the notebook. 1995. 19 is written inside the circle, and Roland Baker, Albert Klein, and Isabel Klein are densely marked outside the circle. The rain has stopped. He walked into the study and sent the cloud disk link to the email addresses of 3 independent media outlets. When the send button was pressed, the blackthorn flowers outside the window swayed in the wind, as if someone was clapping gently in the dark. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Aidan took a nap, leaning back in his swivel chair. The phone screen suddenly lit up. It was a message from Charles. The City Hall will hold an emergency meeting this morning. The agenda is dealing with historical land disputes. He rubbed his sore eyes, took out a pen, and drew an arrow next to him. At the end of the arrow, he wrote 2 words. Tomorrow. At 5 in the morning, Aidan's phone vibrated on the coffee table. He grabbed the phone, and the screen lit up with a message from Charles. The backup timeline for the City Hall archives has been sorted out. What time do you need me to arrive? He got out of bed and fished out a USB flash drive from his suit pocket. Inside it were all the evidence he had copied from the attic. Darkroom last night, Albert's diary, the emails between Old Hawk and Roland, regarding the title deed, and the videotape of Isabel before she committed suicide. 7 o'clock window seat in the cafe. After he replied, he took out 3 envelopes and stuffed the addresses of 3 independent media outlets into them. In addition to the USB drive, there was also a note in the envelope. The truth is more important than the headlines. At 7 o'clock, Charles rushed into the cafe, wrapped in a raincoat. The young man had dark circles under his eyes. He slapped a stack of printed papers on the table. On May 18th, 1995, Roland froze the Klein family's land in the name of the municipal government. On the 19th, Isabel took her son to the City Hall to protest and was dragged away by security guards. On the 20th, the bodies of mother and son were found in an abandoned warehouse. He pushed his glasses. I changed the dates on these records 7 times. Now I can finally hand them over intact. Aidan stuffed one of the timelines into an envelope and pushed it to Charles. Anonymous email address sent at 3 p.m. Charles clenched the envelope, his knuckles turning white. They said I was a paralegal and should help cover it up. But he suddenly looked up. But Albert showed me Isabel's suicide note. She wrote, "Mom is sorry for you. I couldn't get you back to the sunshine." Aidan didn't respond, but glanced at his watch. It's time to go to Baker's office. Roland's office is on the top floor of City Hall. When Aidan rang the doorbell, the secretary came out with coffee. "Mr. Hawk, Congressman Baker said you'll be there at 9, 10 minutes early." Aidan put the recorder and the note with the video link on the secretary's tray. "Please pass it on." Just as the secretary was about to speak, the office door opened with a click. Roland was wearing a dark gray suit and the same silver gray bow tie as last night. "Mr. Hawk, so early." Aidan walked in and closed the door behind him. "Let's talk about the 1995 title deed." Roland tapped his fingers on the table twice. "Young man, I can sue you for defamation." "Then explain this." Aidan pressed the recorder. After the sound of electricity, it was Isabel's voice. She cried, with noisy voices in the background. "Mr. Baker, my son didn't steal the deed. It was Mr. Hawk who said that as long as we move out, he will give us compensation." "That's enough." Roland stood up suddenly, his tie crooked. "Where did you get it?" "And this?" Aidan opened his phone. In the video, a 14-year-old boy was grabbed by the arm by a security guard. Isabel pounced on him to scratch him, but was kicked away. The boy cried and called Mom, and Isabel's head hit the marble column, and blood flowed down her face. Roland's face was as white as a sheet of paper. He suddenly lunged for Aidan's phone, but was dodged. "You think you can bring me down with this?" He loosened his tie. "There are 20 witnesses at the City Hall who can prove that." "Witness?" Aidan sneered. "This morning, 3 media outlets received Albert's diary. which said that you received 500,000 Australian dollars from Hawke. He pointed out the window. Listen. There were footsteps in the corridor. Roland moved closer to the window, his pupils shrinking suddenly. There were 5 news broadcast vehicles parked downstairs, and reporters were rushing upstairs with microphones in hand. I told them to arrive at 9 o'clock sharp. Aidan put his phone in his inner pocket. Now it's 9 o'clock and 1 minute. The moment the door was pushed open, Roland stumbled back and knocked over the coffee cup on the coffee table. The brown liquid soaked through his silver-gray bow tie like a piece of coagulated blood. At 12 noon, a news push popped up on Aidan's phone. City Councilman Roland Baker was involved in the Blackthorn Manor case of forcing a mother and son to death, and has been suspended for investigation. In the accompanying picture, Roland was surrounded by reporters, his tie crooked on his neck, and his expression stiff. Another piece of news is Vivian's statement video. She stood in the hospital corridor in a white coat, with a sign of Medical Ethics Committee behind her. Edward Hawke once used patients to conduct illegal muscle relaxant experiments. As a private doctor, I knew about it, but did not report it. She took a deep breath. But today, I want to make all the experimental records public. Aidan stared at Vivian's red eyes in the video. That was the first time that old Hawke's illegitimate daughter faced her own identity. At 6 in the evening, Lillian's gallery was packed with people. Aidan stood in the back row, looking at the paintings on the wall. This time it is not her usual abstract blocks of color, but 2 women. A young mother in a floral dress, holding a boy wearing a red scarf in her arms, and another woman in a nurse's uniform, sorting out a medicine box with her head down. This is Isabel and her son, Lillian said, standing in front of the painting, her voice as light as a feather. This is my mother, Isabel's best friend. She said that the last time Isabel came to see her, she had a copy of Hawke's deed in her pocket. She looked up, her eyes shining. They shouldn't have been buried in the thorn bush. Someone in the crowd applauded, followed by a round of thank you. Aidan pulled out his notebook and drew a star next to the name Lillian Finch. At 10 o'clock in the evening, at the ruins of Blackthorn Manor, Aidan sat by the broken wall, his notebook spread across his lap. The last page reads, 1995-19. Justice will not be late, as long as you are willing to keep going. The wind blew through the thorny flowers, carrying a few petals onto the notebook. As he closed the notebook, the cell phone in his pocket vibrated. It was a message from the hotel front desk. You have an anonymous letter left at the front desk. Aidan looked at the dimming lights in the distance and stuffed the notebook into the inner pocket of his windbreaker. There has to be some suspense about what happens 3 days later. He stood up, his shadow stretched long by the moonlight, like an arrow pointing to the future. 3 days later, in the morning, when Aidan pushed open the glass door of the hotel reception, his knuckles were still cool from last night's rain. Anonymous letter? He repeated the receptionist's words, his Adam's apple moving. The girl in the blue uniform pulled out a craft paper envelope from the drawer. The edges were frayed, old-fashioned paper pressed by hand. When Aidan took it, his fingertips rubbed across the paper texture, as if he was touching the old times from 30 years ago. A photo fell out of the envelope. He bent down to pick it up, and the image in the photo made his pupils shrink into pinpoints. In the corner of the cellar of Blackthorn Manor, there was a crack under the blue stone slab, and the steps extending downwards could be vaguely seen. On the back was written in pen, "You haven't found the real evidence yet." The signature was a hand-painted thorn flower, with ink on the edges of the petals, like wet blood. The phone vibrated in my palm. Ethan Blair's name popped up, and the sound of cameras clicking was heard in the background. "I just caught Roland's secretary at City Hall," the reporter said in a low voice. "She said that old Hawke's land deed files were burned in." "Come to the manor ruins," Aidan interrupted him, stuffing the photo into the inner pocket of his windbreaker. Now, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the 2 men stood in front of the charred broken wall. Ethan's drone was hovering overhead, the sound of its propellers breaking up the smell of burning in the wind. "Look at the screen." He turned the tablet toward Aiden, and in the picture the cracks where the cellar collapsed were like a wound, extending to the bottom of the abandoned stable on the west side. "The fire of 30 years ago." Aiden took out a pen and circled the notebook. "It burned the title deed, and also burned Albert's son." Ethan's Adam's apple moved. "The file says that the mother and son committed suicide. So someone asked us to look at this." Aiden tapped the photo. At the same time, 3 kilometers away in the Collins Street law firm, Lucia Klein's high heels made crisp sounds as they stepped on the marble floor. She slapped her passport on the front desk, her blonde hair glowing coldly under the chandelier. "I want to check Albert Klein's will." The receptionist stared at the granddaughter relationship on the passport, her fingers hovering over the computer keyboard. "I need court permission." "He's my grandfather," Lucia interrupted, her voice as light as an icicle. "And your law firm has been keeping his documents for 30 years. 5 minutes later, she was sitting on a wooden chair in the archives room, with a yellowed copy of the will spread out in front of her. The last page suddenly stopped, and the fingertips pressed on the air column blank. "Who is my father?" She looked up suddenly, and asked the lawyer who followed her in, "Why is his name not in any of the records?" The lawyer pushed up his glasses. "Mr. Albert never mentioned any offspring other than his son, but I exist." Lucia dug her nails into her palms. "My mother said before she died that my father died in a fire." Aiden received a call from his lawyer in the evening. He stood beside the broken wall of the manor ruins, listening to the retelling on the phone, the tip of his pen poking a hole in the notebook. "May 20, 1995. He shouted to Ethan, "Check the birth registration file. Find the fire accident record." The archive's old air conditioner hums. When Aiden turned to the 17th box of files, the dust made him cough. On the yellowed page, the cause of death column for Albert Crane's son was smeared with black ink, with a few words showing on the edge. "Accidental fire. Key witness." Ethan pointed to the note next to it. "There is a firefighter named Thomas Reed who wrote in the fire report that there was a smell of gasoline at the fire scene." Thomas Reed. Aiden put a question mark next to the name Lucia. Maybe her father. As the moon rose above the spire of the manor, Aiden and Lucia went down to the cellar by flashlight. The rubble from the collapse hurt her ankles. Lucia's breathing was particularly clear in the confined space. "My mother said that my father left behind an iron box." The charred wooden boxes were piled in the corner, and Aiden pried up the top one with a pen. The smell of mold and burnt wood came out, and his fingertips suddenly stopped. Half of a rusty iron box was exposed under the wooden box, and the lock was wrapped with rotten red silk. "That's it." Lucia's voice trembled. When the iron box was opened, rust fell down. Inside lay a tape and a leather-bound diary. Aiden pressed the old tape recorder he brought with him. After the electric sound, a young man's voice rang out. "On May 19, 1995, Hawk's men came to knock on the door. They said they wanted to burn the title deed. Isabel, note, Albert's late wife, hid in the attic, holding little John." Lucia put her hand over her mouth. Suddenly the sound of glass breaking was heard in the recording, followed by a man's roar. "Run." Then there was a crackling fire, and a child's crying, which was swallowed up by an explosion. The pages of the diary were as brittle as dead leaves. The last page reads, "The debt they owe is more than just one life." Isabel and John's ashes were mixed with gasoline, but Thomas's testimony was also burned. "My grandson, he should know where he came from." The date of signature is March 15, 2023. In Albert's handwriting, Lucia's tears dripped onto the page, creating a smudge of ink. "So grandfather, he wants you to find these." Aiden closed the diary, the tape burning in his palms, and the anonymous letter. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Aiden sat by the window of the hotel. The moonlight shines through the gauze curtain, casting a silver edge on the iron box. He took out his cell phone and sent a message to Ethan. See you at the usual place at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The tape cast a thin shadow on the bedside table, like a taut string that could break at any time. At dawn there was a deafening noise. In the morning mist, Aidan pushed the brown envelope across the wooden table of the cafe. There was half a cold croissant pressed on the corner of the envelope, which was Ethan's usual breakfast. The original is in the hotel safe. He tapped the envelope with his pen. The copies are enough for you to cut 3 news articles. Ethan's Adam's apple moved, and his fingertips rubbed the seal of the envelope. The name of the detective in the recording, James Hudson. Yes. Aidan opened his notebook, on which was a newspaper clipping. Former Detective James Hudson becomes consultant to Baker Group, dated 3 months ago. Ethan took out his phone and swiped it quickly. I checked. Baker Group just won the bid for a development project in Melbourne's western suburbs. Blackthorn Manor is within the planning scope. He suddenly clenched the envelope. Albert said Hudson participated in the fake fire scene that year, so his current master might be the one who gave the order back then. Aidan closed his notebook. Your radio station will be on air at 12 noon. Ethan rapped his knuckles on the table. Risk? I'll carry it. The bottom of the coffee cup hit the porcelain plate, making a crisp sound. Aidan was standing in the hotel corridor when Lucia called. Her breathing was rapid. I found the architectural plans. Where? At the bottom of the filing cabinet in the basement. Lucia paused for 2 seconds. There are pencil marks on the back of the drawing. I developed it with toner. Aidan took out a pen and tapped it on his palm. Secret passage. It connects to the cellar and the drainage system. Lucia's voice was even lower. The end point is marked Holy Cross Tomb. Holy Cross Church. Aidan remembered that it was an old church on the outskirts of Melbourne that had been abandoned for 20 years, and half of its spire had collapsed in a rainstorm. He stared at the sycamore leaves outside the window that were blown crooked by the wind. Send me a scan. It has been sent, Lucia added before hanging up. In my grandfather's diary, there was a cross next to the name Isabel. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Aidan stood under the crystal chandelier at the Baker Group dinner. He wore a rented dark grey suit and imitation cufflinks bought from a pawn shop, enough to sneak into the VIP lounge as a Far East trader's assistant. James Hudson was 10 meters away. His silver hair was neatly combed, his belly was slightly protruding under his navy blue suit, and he was chatting and laughing with a real estate developer while holding a glass of champagne. Aidan touched the original tape in his inner pocket. Mr. Hudson, he squeezed through the crowd. My boss wants to talk to you about the development of the western suburbs. Assistant Hudson's eyes swept over his cufflinks. Mr. Baker's time is valuable, but your time may be more valuable. Aidan lowered his voice. About the fire on Main. Hudson's pupils shrank to pinpoints. Beneath the broken walls of the manor ruins, the chirping of crickets was torn apart by the wind. Hudson's hand was shaking as he held the tape. The metal buckle scraped against his fingertips, causing blood to seep out. Where did you get it? Albert's cellar. Aidan leaned against the stump of a pillar. His grandchildren have been looking for it for 10 years. Old man. Hudson suddenly laughed. His laughter stuck in his throat like a rusty gear. Do you think I want to burn that mother and child? The approval document from the mayor's office that year. He pulled out a yellowed piece of paper from his suit pocket. Read it yourself. The document is titled Instructions on the Stability Maintenance Work of Hawke Real Estate Projects, and is stamped with the late mayor's private seal at the end, dated May. Eliminate unstable factors. Aidan read the last line. So you burned the deeds, burned the witnesses, and burned Albert's house. Hudson loosened his tie. Now the Baker Group wants to demolish Blackthorn to build a shopping mall. Albert's revenge. He suddenly grabbed Aidan's wrist. Do you think you'll be done if you find me? For real? That's enough. Aidan shook his hand off. What's in the Holy Cross crypt? Hudson's face turned pale instantly. Under the lamp in the hotel room, Aidan laid out the scanned copy of the architectural plan on top of the documents. The red line of the drainage system is like a snake, emerging from the Blackthorn cellar, winding for 2 kilometers, and finally piercing into the foundation of the Church of the Holy Cross. He took out a pen and drew a circle around the words Holy Cross Crypt. Outside the circle, the last page of Albert's diary came to mind. Isabel and John's ashes were mixed with gasoline, but Thomas's testimony was also burned. My grandson, he should know where he came from. Outside the window, half of the moon was bitten off by dark clouds. The phone on the bedside table lit up with a message from Lucia. I can get the church key before dawn. Aidan turned off the light. In the darkness, he felt for the tape in the inside pocket of his suit, and it felt like a piece of red-hot iron. Behind the stone door of the Holy Cross Crypt lies more than just Albert's secrets. Also, the truth is that the fire that year was not completely burned. Lucia turned the key 3 times in the keyhole. The sound of metal rubbing against each other pierced the pre-dawn silence, and the beam of Aidan's flashlight swept across the church's stained glass, cutting the eyes of the Virgin Mary into pieces. The 3rd tile to the left. She lowered her voice, her heels tapping on the blue stone slabs. The entrance to the tomb was hidden behind the confessional. A musty smell mixed with burning incense came out. Aidan's pen tip tapped twice on the edge of the notebook. This was his habit when he was nervous. 7 steps down, the air suddenly turned cooler. The light from Lucia's phone screen revealed scratches on the wall, like the paw prints of some animal. Grandpa said that the last clean bone of the Klein family is buried here. Her voice trembled, and a beam of light swept across the deepest stone door. The door is not locked. The smell of rotting wood came out first, followed by cold, as Aidan's flashlight illuminated the coffin. Lucia's phone clattered to the floor. The dark red coffin lid was half open, and the corpse was wearing a white shirt with a yellowed paper pinned to his chest. Alexander Crane. Lucia squatted down and touched the edge of the coffin with her fingertips. My father said he disappeared 20 years ago. She dug her nails into her palm. The words on his chest. Aidan leaned forward. The edges of the note were burnt, but the ink was clear. I'm innocent. There were marks of ligatures on the wrists of the corpse, and a purple bruise on the back of the neck, as if left by a struggle when someone pushed him into the water. Look at the wall. Lucia stood up suddenly, and the beam of light swung to the side. A hand-drawn map filled half of the wall, densely covered with pencil lines. Old Hawk's name was circled in red, connected to the city councilor's office, and then to the court and fire station of that time. There was a letter under the map, and the edge of the letter was sealed with wax, with a thorn flower as the seal. Lucia's hands were shaking as she tore open the seal. To everyone who was willing to listen. On May 19th, 1995, my Isabel and John did not set themselves on fire but were doused with gasoline. They shouted. We didn't steal the deed, but no one believed them. My Alexander went to the newspaper office to find evidence, and was found by the river the next day. She couldn't read any more. The letter rustled. Grandpa said that he wanted everyone to know that we are not monsters, but we just don't want to remain silent anymore. Car horns were heard outside the church. Aidan's phone lit up. It was a message from Ethan. An internal email from the Baker Group was intercepted half an hour ago. They planned to bribe the forensic doctor to destroy the evidence in the tomb. Now, Aidan grabbed the map and stuffed it into his arms. Take a video or the details. As Lucia's phone began recording, he noticed her fingers touching the coffin. There was a notch there, a tiny thorn flower.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, Isabel's report, testimony under the blackthorns, set the internet on fire.
In the video, Alexander's face, the bloody note, and Albert's letter flashed one after another. Aidan was staring at the push notifications on his phone when he saw the headlines Roland Baker is subpoenaed and James Hudson resigns as city councilor's advisor pop up. The church door was knocked open. Father Thomas leaned against the door frame, breathing heavily, his white beard matted with morning dew. Albert came here 30 years ago with an iron box. He told me to give the box to someone who could unlock the secret of Blackthorn if he died someday. He pulled out a rusty iron box from his arms. Now I think it's time. In the iron box was the original title deed, stamped with the official seal of 1995, and a photo. Albert's wife was holding their little daughter, standing in front of the boundary marker of Old Hawk's property. At the entrance of the tomb in the evening, Lucia put the ring on her ring finger. It was taken from Alexander's finger, and LC was engraved on the inside of the silver ring, the initials of his wife's name. I always blamed him for only knowing how to polish silver and repair bookshelves. She looked at the ruins of Blackthorn Manor in the distance. It turns out that he didn't polish silver, but the knife of revenge. Aiden said nothing. His notebook was open on his knees. The latest page showed the floor plan of the tomb, with the location of Alexander's coffin circled 3 times in red pen. As I left late at night, the church clock struck 11. Aiden closed the notebook, and the metal clasp clicked. When he turned around, the moonlight was shining on the entrance of the tomb. He vaguely saw Albert standing there, his back still hunched, but his eyes were as bright as stars. "You win," he said to the air. The wind brought the scent of thorn flowers towards me. Lucia's car stopped at the intersection and flashed its lights twice. Aiden touched the iron box in his inner pocket. The edge of the title deed inside hurt his skin, like some unfinished oath. As the first rays of morning sunlight climbed over the church spire, Lucia's cell phone alarm rang. She looked at the coffin covered with white cloth on the passenger seat, then turned to Aiden and said, "The forensic center will open at 8 o'clock. Aiden started the engine. In the rear-view mirror, the cross of the Holy Cross Church was shining like a knife that opened the darkness. At 6:40 in the morning, Lucia's car ran over a thin layer of frost and stopped in front of the forensic center. She and Aiden carried the coffin wrapped in white cloth through the side door. The staff waiting there took the body with complicated expressions. The words Alexander Crane signed in the registration book were like a blunt blow. "The report will be out at 10 o'clock, Aiden said, handing the letter of authorization to the clerk behind the window. Lucia stood on the steps and looked at the sky. The gray clouds were hanging low in the sky, and the wind blew the fallen leaves around in circles, just like the spider webs that were floating in the tomb last night. "They won't even let me go on my last journey," she whispered, her fingers unconsciously stroking the autopsy order number on the screen of her mobile phone. At 10:07, Aiden's mailbox vibrated. The PDF file loaded slowly, as if deliberately delaying the truth from coming out. Time of death, around midnight on April. Cause of death, craniocerebral injury, consistent with the characteristics of falling from a high altitude. The two sat side by side in the corner of the cafe, with pages spread out on the table, their handwriting as cold and hard as nails. Lucia bit her lower lip. Old Hawk forged the evidence at 3 in the morning. That is, Alexander was already dead before he announced that Albert's son had committed suicide. The sound of sirens outside the window broke the silence. It was at this time that Ethan's second report exploded on the internet. The headline read, "The Judge Under the Blackthorn." The accompanying pictures are a high-definition scan of Albert's hand-drawn map, the original title deed, and the yellowed photo, Albert's wife holding their daughter, standing in front of the boundary marker of the Old Hawk property. The article links together the 30-year chain of revenge with a calm but sharp brushstroke. When power covers up the truth, silence becomes the sharpest knife. The hot search instantly topped the list.
At 12:15 noon, the municipal government held an emergency press conference.
Andrew Grayson stood on the podium, his suit neatly ironed, and his expression restrained. The camera pans over his tie clip, which bears a miniature version of the Baker Group logo. "We respect the judicial process in handling historical cases," he said, "but we must emphasize that any accusation against government agencies must be based on solid evidence." Someone in the press box raised his hand. "Do you deny that Old Hawk had anything to do with the land dispute?" "I can't comment on unconfirmed history," Andrew answered flawlessly, his tone as steady as a monologue that had been rehearsed thousands of times. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Father Thomas appeared at the door of the church secret room. In his hands he held a tattered account book, the cover of which had faded to the color of dead leaves. "This is the old archive of the monastery," he said, turning to a page. 30 years ago, an anonymous donation was made to expand the orphanage. The type on the paper is blurry, but the name of the donor can still be identified. Hawker Resources Holdings Limited. Aiden's pen tip paused on the notebook, and the ink spread out into a small dot. "I tried to persuade Albert to let it go," the priest sighed, but he just smiled and said, "Some debts must be repaid." As dusk deepened, Aiden walked out of the church and saw Lucia's car parked at the entrance of the alley, with the lights off. He got into the passenger seat and put the copy of the account book into his inner pocket. The iron box was still there, pressing against his chest. The phone vibrated again. Ethan sent a link. Hudson resigned as a consultant, and his resignation letter did not even mention Blackthorn. Aiden didn't reply. He looked at the gradually lit city lights outside the window and suddenly realized something. This reckoning was not done by Albert alone. Behind the scenes there is an invisible hand assisting him in planning the entire chess game, and that hand came from the law enforcement system of that time. He opened a copy of the document provided by James Hudson and saw 3 names on the first page. They were all core law enforcement officers who investigated the land case 30 years ago. Next to the last name there was a scribbled note, "Already alive, retired on the Sunshine Coast." Aiden closed the file and rapped his knuckles on the windowsill. "Where to go next?" Lucy asked. "Looking for someone," he said in a low voice. "Someone who knows the truth." As the car drove into the dusk, the church cross in the rearview mirror looked like a knife cutting through the fog, and in the ruins of Blackthorn Manor in the distance, the wind blew a thorn flower, which gently fell and landed on the steps that had long been deserted. Aiden stared at the video in the mailbox and slowly scrolled down the mouse wheel. The picture froze at the moment when Albert and the man in the suit were confronting each other. Although the lens is blurry, the texture of the badge is breathtakingly clear, the official logo of the Melbourne City Council. Instead of clicking on the video right away, he closed his laptop and rubbed his chin with his fingers. The wind outside the hotel window whistled over the eaves, like some secret whisper. He knew that this was not just a case of family revenge, but a systematic cover-up spanning 3 decades and involving both the political and business circles. Who are they? Old Hawk is not alone, and neither is Albert alone. It's a part of the entire power structure. Those who chose to remain silent back then and still want to remain silent now. When Lucia pushed the door open, she saw Aiden standing by the window, lost in thought. In her hand was the message Ethan had just sent. Target address confirmed. Retired prosecutor James Lane, living in the Paxton community in the southern suburbs of Melbourne. "Is he still there?" she asked. "We have to go and see for ourselves." Aiden grabbed his coat and put the pen into the inner pocket. The iron box was still against his chest, as if it was some kind of heavy reminder. The Paxton neighborhood was eerily quiet, the chill of the winter night hitting early. It was already 6 o'clock in the evening when the two arrived at Ryan's residence. The snow in front of the door has not been swept, and the mailbox is as empty as a tomb. All the lights in the house were turned off and the curtains were drawn. Aiden went around to the backyard and found the kitchen door ajar. The door lock was intact, but the room was in a mess. Drawers were open, and documents were scattered on the floor, as if someone had been hastily rummaging through something. They found a note on the coffee table in the living room. The paper was crumpled, and the handwriting was scribbled. "Stop digging." There was no signature, but the tone was filled with warning and fear. Back in the car, Aidan looked out the window at the darkening sky and whispered, "He escaped, or was taken away." The phone vibrated. It was a message from Ethan. "Just found out that Ryan withdrew all his savings from the bank yesterday, and the account balance has returned to zero." Lucia frowned. They are really taking action. Late at night, the phone in the hotel room suddenly rang. Aidan glanced at the caller ID. Unknown number. He pressed the answer button. "You're too close. They'll stop at nothing." The voice was hoarse and intermittent, with a hint of electronic interference. But the sense of oppression was real. Less than a minute after the call was hung up, the email notification tone rang again. An anonymous encrypted email quietly lies in the inbox. Attached to it is a 23-second video. Aidan clicked it. The picture was dim, and the camera was shaking. Albert stood in the middle of the Mana's study, with a grim expression. The man opposite has his back to the camera, revealing only the badge on his chest, the current Melbourne City emblem, with Model Unit for Municipal Construction in 2023, engraved on the golden background. The conversation was unclear, but Albert's gestures clearly showed an argument. The next second, the picture stopped abruptly. Aidan's heartbeat quickened. This is not simply a private revenge, but a secret deal involving the top leaders of contemporary municipal government. He closed the mailbox and walked to the window. The lights of the city in the distance are like countless pairs of eyes, watching everything in the darkness. "Tomorrow," he said, "we're going to the municipal archives." Lucia looked at him, a trace of worry flashing in her eyes. "What do you want to retrieve?" "The records of the cooperation projects between the government and enterprises 30 years ago." Aidan's voice was low. "Especially the Hawke-Baker land development plan." The night wind blew in through the window, ruffling a corner of the document on the table. And in the distance, on the ruins of Blackthorn Manor, another thorn flower fell quietly and silently. The next morning, the sky in Melbourne was grey, as if the chill of last night had not yet dissipated. Aidan drove to the municipal archives, an old building that looked low-key on the outside, but was home to many hidden talents. After presenting his lawyer-authorized identification, he successfully retrieved the relevant files of the Hawke-Baker land development plan. The archive room was filled with the unique musty smell of old paper. The sunlight slanted in through the blinds, casting long and thin shadows on the table. Aidan flipped through the yellowed documents, and finally found an old photo in a compartment. The photo shows 3 people standing side by side: Old Hawke, Roland Baker, and Albert. All 3 of them were wearing neat suits, and standing in front of Blackthorn Manor, with smiles on their faces. The Gothic tower in the background looks majestic and mysterious in the sunlight. "To our future self." A line of words was written on the back of the photo with a pen, and the handwriting was neat and powerful. Aidan stared at the photo for a long time, his brows furrowed tighter and tighter. He put the photo away and walked out of the archives. Lucia was waiting for him at the door. "What did you find?" she asked. Aidan said nothing, just handed her the photo. Lucia took it. Her eyes swept across the faces of the 3 people, and finally stopped on Albert. When he was young, he had a handsome face and clear eyes, completely unlike the hunched, secretive old butler he is today. He doesn't look like someone who hates them, more like a friend who once believed in them, Lucia murmured to herself. "I'm beginning to doubt whether my grandfather's revenge is truly just." Aidan didn't respond, but just gently closed the file box in his hand. He knew that the truth was far more complicated than it seemed. That afternoon he met with Vivian Carter again. The private doctor's apartment is located in a quiet old building in the city center, with Melbourne skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. As soon as Aidan entered the room, he saw Vivian already sitting on the sofa, holding a glass of red wine in her hand, with an abnormally calm expression. "What do you want?" she asked. "Your birth certificate," Aidan said bluntly. Vivian was silent for a moment, then stood up and walked into the bedroom. A few minutes later, she returned with a yellowed copy of the hospital record and handed it to Aidan. The pages were thin and curled at the edges, obviously very old. Aiden flipped through the pages quickly, and suddenly his pupils shrank. Vivian's mother was a nurse at the Hawke family's private clinic, which was funded by Roland Baker. This discovery shocked him. This is not a coincidence, but some kind of hidden connection. Roland not only has an interest in Old Hawke, but he had even been involved in the Hawke family's life as early as 30 years ago. Did you know this? Aiden looked up at Vivian. She took a sip of wine and said softly, I know I'm not Old Hawke's daughter, but I didn't expect that my mother and Roland also had an intersection. Aiden put down the documents, thought for a moment, then stood up and said goodbye. When he reached the door, Vivian suddenly spoke. If there are more secrets behind this, will you reveal it? Aiden glanced back at her and said firmly, I've gone too far. As night falls and the wind picks up, the city lights are like countless pairs of eyes spying on this unfinished game of chess. Meanwhile, in a gallery downtown, Lillian Finch is sorting through newly arrived works. She is a sensitive and persistent woman with an almost obsessive passion for art. Just as she was unwrapping a new painting, she heard the whispers of two curators. Under the Thorns? It sounds like a cursed name. Yes, I heard it was donated anonymously, and its origin is unknown. But the style is very unique, and it may fetch a high price. Lillian paused slightly, and looked up at the painting placed in the corner. The canvas is large and the picture is dark, but in the center there is a scarlet flower blooming under layers of thorns. She narrowed her eyes and slowly approached. An inexplicable sense of familiarity rises from the bottom of my heart. It was a dark night, and the streets of Melbourne were illuminated by the sparse streetlights. The gallery was eerily quiet, with only the sound of Lillian's footsteps on the wooden floor. She stood in front of the painting titled Under the Thorns, her eyes fixed on the blurred signature in the lower right corner. Odd, the brushstrokes are rough, but full of tension, as if the emotions that had been suppressed for many years are poured into every stroke. She pulled out her phone and did a quick search to see if Roland Baker had anything to do with art when he was young. The result made her heart beat faster. In 1987, a painter named R.B. participated in an underground exhibition, and the works exhibited were exactly the themes of manners, thorns and bloody flowers depicted in Gothic style. It's Roland, she muttered to herself. Without hesitation, she called Aiden immediately. In the hotel room, Aiden was sitting at the table with several documents spread out in front of him, and the wall was covered with diagrams showing the relationships between the clues. He had just hung up the phone with Lillian, his fingertips gently stroking his chin, his eyes as sharp as a knife. Roland was a painter. He quickly looked up Roland Baker's background information and looked up his early years. Sure enough, on a page of newspaper silhouettes that had been almost ignored, it was written, between 1985 and 1990, R.B. created several private commissions, anonymously. He closed his eyes and quickly connected all the information in his mind. Old Hawke Albert and Roland once smiled side by side in the same photo. Vivian's mother was a nurse in the clinic, funded by Roland, and now this painting has reappeared, and it was actually created by Roland. This is not a coincidence. This is some kind of deeply hidden information network. He stood up, closed his notebook, and prepared to call Lillian back to further confirm the painting style and signature details, but at this moment his cell phone vibrated. A text message popped up from an unknown number. What you are looking for is hidden in the mirror. Aiden frowned and quickly checked the time it was sent. 1:07 in the morning. He glanced at the mirror in the room, then lowered his head and chewed over the words again and again. Mirror. This word made his heart move. He suddenly remembered an antique mirror in the ruins of Blackthorn Manor. The mirror was about 2 meters high, with a copper-carved frame, and stood alone in an empty room at the end of the corridor on the 2nd floor. He paused there for a moment, but did not examine it closely, for the mirror never appeared on any architectural drawings or records of the estate's layout. It shouldn't exist. and now it may hold the answers they've been looking for. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the wind was howling outside the hotel window, as if something was stirring in the darkness. Aidan picked up his coat, walked to the door, and whispered a reply to the voice message left by Lucia. "Come with me to the manor tomorrow morning." The early morning wind blew through the dilapidated window frames, blowing the cobwebs on the antique mirror at the end of the corridor on the second floor of Blackthorn Manor. Aidan stood in front of the mirror, his fingers gently brushing over the carved copper frame. Lucia Crane stood behind him, looking around vigilantly. "Are you sure it's here?" she asked in a low voice. Aidan nodded. The text said, "What you're looking for is hidden in the mirror." He reached out and gently pushed the mirror, thinking it was just some decorative wall structure, but he didn't expect the mirror to shake slightly. He increased the force, and the entire mirror slowly rotated, revealing a narrow stone staircase leading down to the depths of darkness. Lucia gasped. "That's impossible. My grandfather worked here for 30 years, and never mentioned such a place." Aidan fished out his phone and turned on the flashlight mode, the beam of light cutting through the thick darkness. "Then it's even more worth going in and taking a look." The two men carefully entered the secret passage, one in front and one behind, and their footsteps echoed between the empty stone walls. The air was filled with the smell of dampness and decay, as if time had stopped here for 100 years. After climbing a dozen steps, they came to a secret underground room. The walls were covered in dust, and a few old pieces of furniture and broken picture frames were piled in the corners. The most eye-catching thing is the several yellowed photos hanging on the wall. Each one is closely related to the history of Old Hawk Manor. Aidan's attention was attracted by one of the photos. In the photo, Roland Baker was wearing a neat suit standing next to a stern woman, and the background was a hospital laboratory. The woman's face was very similar to Vivian's. Even her eyes revealed the same calmness and sharpness. His heartbeat suddenly quickened, and he quickly took a photo with his mobile phone and sent it to reporter Ethan Blair, with a message, "Find out who this woman is." Then he walked over to a desk in the middle of the room. The drawer was already somewhat loose and opened with a slight pull. Inside was an old cassette case and a stack of handwritten notes next to it. He picked up the tape and looked through the notes. The handwriting was sloppy but powerful, as if it was written by someone in extreme emotion. List of people who falsified experimental data in 1993. Roland Beck, Old Hawk, and Albert knew about it, but did not report it. The truth should not be buried. Aidan frowned, put the tape into the small player he carried with him, and pressed the play button. After the rustling noise, a deep and familiar voice sounded. "As long as you control the experimental data, you can control the entire industry." "It's Roland Baker." Next came an older voice, with suppressed anger. "Do you think no one knows? I will make you regret your choice today." Aidan's breathing hitched for a moment. That was Albert's voice. He quickly backed up the recording and continued to look through his notes. More and more information surfaced. A record of illegal human experiments, an unsent letter of complaint, and even summaries of testimonies from some of the participants at the time. "This isn't revenge," Aidan muttered. "This is a reckoning." Lucia walked up to him and looked at the photos on the wall and the documents on the table. Her face became paler and paler. "These are all left by my grandfather. What did he want to do?" Aidan was silent for a moment, then slowly spoke. "He is waiting for someone who can reveal all this." His cell phone vibrated, interrupting his thoughts. Was Ethan's reply. "The woman in the photo has been identified as Margaret Watson, Vivian's biological mother's sister. She was a researcher for an international medical organization. She disappeared in 1996. The official death was determined to be an accidental drowning, but her family never found her body." Aidan held the phone tightly, and a shocking speculation emerged in his mind. What if she was one of the key figures in the experiment? He looked up at Lucia and said firmly, What we found is enough to shake the secret of the entire Blackthorn family. But it's not enough. Lucia bit her lip. You mean there's more? Aidan looked into the depths of the room, where there was a half-open iron door that seemed to lead to a deeper basement. Of course, he whispered. This is just the beginning. The sky outside gradually brightened, and the morning light poured into the room through the cracks in the ruins, illuminating a corner of the yellowed photo. In the photo, Roland Baker's mouth corners were slightly raised, and there was a light in his eyes that did not belong to a winner. And at that moment, Aidan finally understood what Albert meant by the word liquidation. He turned around and whispered to Lucia, "Let's go, we need more evidence." And in the corner that he couldn't see, a broken lens reflected a faint light, as if some long-hidden existence was quietly watching everything. Ethan Blair's report Mirror World Under Blackthorn was released at 3 o'clock in the morning, and in just 40 minutes, the number of readers exceeded 1. After the photo and the accompanying picture was enlarged, it was clearly visible that Roland Baker was standing side by side with the mysterious woman. Although the recording clip was short, it was enough to trigger public opinion. "This is not a murder," he wrote. "This is the echo of a dirty deal that happened 30 years ago." The internet was immediately in an uproar, with news headlines everywhere. Political and business collusion, Blackthorn Manor, leads to old case suspicion. Relatives of missing researcher speak out. The truth is never far away. Is Albert Klein a murderer or the embodiment of justice? The comment section of Roland Beck's social media account was instantly overwhelmed, with his former supporters defecting one after another, and the opposition taking the opportunity to launch a fierce attack. The police spokesman held an emergency meeting and announced that they would reopen the investigation into Roland Baker's business dealings around 1995 and interview relevant persons. At the same time, an anonymous email quietly landed in Aidan's private mailbox. The sender was signed EW and had only one sentence. "I have seen the original of what you found." Aidan frowned and clicked on the attachment. A scanned photo of a yellowed research report with the title, Phase Summary of Clinical Trials of New Muscle Relaxants, July 9. He immediately called Lucia and asked, "Do you remember the abnormal components in Old Hawk's blood when he died?" "Of course." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's that kind of medicine." A few minutes later, they were standing outside the Melbourne Archives. It was a dark night. The streets were empty, with only the street lamps casting mottled shadows. A woman in a grey windbreaker walked out from the side door, looking cautious. "Aidan Hawke," she whispered. "You're Emily Watson." She nodded, her eyes flickering with mixed emotions. "I'm not here to help you. I'm here to confirm whether you have found the final agreement. You knew it existed?" Aidan caught her wording sharply. "I was sorting through a long-forgotten medical file when I accidentally saw a photocopy of it." Emily lowered her voice. "It was not a will but a contract. It was signed in the early spring of 1994. The signatories included Old Hawk, Roland Baker, and another name that I still can't believe. Albert Klein," Aidan said slowly. Emily's pupils shrank and her lips trembled slightly. "How do you know?" Aidan didn't answer, but gently turned the phone screen towards her. On the screen, there was an excerpt from the tape notes, list of people who falsified experimental data in 1993. Roland Beck, Old Hawk, and Albert knew about it, but did not report it. "Albert is not an Avenger," Aidan whispered. "He is a witness." The air seemed to freeze for a moment. The bells from the clock tower rang in the distance. It was 12 o'clock midnight. Emily was silent for a moment, then took out a leather envelope from her bag. "This is all the information I can provide. You'll have to uncover the rest yourself." She turned and left, disappearing into the night. Aidan looked down at the envelope in his hand, feeling an unprecedented heaviness in his heart. He looked up at Lucia and said, "Let's go back. There are still many things to be done." Lucia nodded, but suddenly stopped and looked behind him. "What is that?" Aidan looked back. Under a pile of old books in the corner of the secret room, a piece of paper was vaguely visible, and on the yellowed corner, the remnants of a wax seal could be vaguely seen. That is the emblem of the Blackthorn family. And below, a line of small words was almost covered by dust. To the final reckoner, in the early morning the dust had not yet settled in the attic secret room of Blackthorn Manor. Aidan Hawke and Lucia Crane stood in front of the pile of old books, the air filled with the smell of decaying paper. "Be careful," Aidan warned in a low voice, carefully moving the books that were pressing on the paper away one by one. Lucia held her breath and gently brushed away the dust on the yellowed paper with her fingers. The wax seal has faded to a dark brown, but the family emblem wrapped in thorns can still be seen. She slowly pulled out the document, and the paper made a slight crisp sound as she unfolded it. Aidan took it, his brows furrowed tighter and tighter. "This is a contract," he whispered, "signed by Old Hawke, Roland Baker, and Albert Crane." Lucia's pupils shrank slightly. "3 of them. How is that possible?" Aidan didn't answer, and quickly flipped through the contents. The documents show that the 3 people jointly invested to establish the Blackthorn Foundation in the early spring of 1994. In name it was to fund medical research, but the terms repeatedly contained vague expressions such as non-public trials, and experimental data must not be leaked. "This is not a charity project," Aidan said in a deep voice. "This is a cover." He immediately turned on his phone, took a photo, and uploaded it to the cloud, then called Ethan Blair.
"Is there any movement over there?" Ethan asked anxiously as soon as the call was connected.
"I'm in the temporary office, next to the Melbourne archives," Aidan explained briefly. "I need you to come over immediately." "No, not the archives headquarters, it's the abandoned database in the East District. I remember you said that there are still some old Foundation files sealed there."
"The Blackthorn Foundation?" Ethan's voice suddenly dropped. "Are you talking about the organization that was deregistered 10 years ago?" "Right. I know where the data room is. I'll be there right away." After hanging up the phone, Aidan looked down at the contract, his eyes becoming more serious. Lucia continued to look through other items, trying to piece together more clues from the details. Suddenly her hand stopped on a book. It was a worn family album, the gold letters on the cover almost peeling off. She opened the first page and was stunned by a photo. In the photo, a much younger Albert is seen holding a baby in front of the Blackthorn Manor. There was a rare smile on his face. Standing behind him was the high-spirited Old Hawke, and a well-dressed, high-spirited man, Roland Baker. Lucia whispered. They were friends. Aidan came over after hearing this. His eyes fell on the photo, and his thoughts began to surge. Albert's silence and forbearance for more than 30 years seemed to have a deeper meaning in an instant. He was once a trustee and a partner, but in the end he became an avenger. He didn't plan all this from the beginning, Aidan muttered to himself. He was pushed into a desperate situation step by step. Just then, hurried footsteps were heard outside the door. "It's me," Ethan's voice rang out. Aidan opened the door and let him in. "I found a medical report," Ethan panted, and handed the document to Aidan. "This information shows that the Blackthorn Foundation once secretly funded a neurotoxin research project. The main researcher was named Dr. Eileen Carter." Lucia looked up suddenly. "Erin Carter? That's Dr. Vivian's sister." "That's right," Ethan nodded. "And the report was signed in July 1995 in a private laboratory in the suburbs of Melbourne." Aidan's fingers slid across the paper, his eyes gradually turning cold. July 1995. Just 1 month before Albert's wife and son committed suicide. He slowly closed the file and said in a low voice, "They used his family as experiments and then pushed him into the abyss." The air was suddenly so heavy that it was suffocating. Lucia asked softly, "So what do we do now?" Aidan stood up and looked further into the room. On the other side of the secret room, there is a small iron door, behind which the outline of an old safe can be vaguely seen. There's still something unfinished, he said. We haven't seen the real truth yet. He walked over to the safe and examined the lock. Digital combination, 4-digit password. He closed his eyes, and the crucial date appeared in his mind. August 17th. That was the day Albert's wife and children committed suicide. This was also the day when the whole tragedy truly began. He opened his eyes and pressed his fingers on the keyboard. 1990. With a click, the lock came loose. The door of the safe slowly opened, and inside lay a cassette tape with the following label: Final Testimony. Aiden's eyes dropped. Aiden pressed the play button, and the old tape recorder made a click sound. Then, a low and hoarse voice slowly flowed out of the speaker. If you hear this, it means I have failed, or finally succeeded. Lucia's fingers trembled slightly, and she subconsciously grabbed Aiden's sleeve. Ethan stood aside, holding his breath. I am Albert Klein, the last steward of Blackthorn Manor. I know that by the time this recording is discovered, I will no longer be alive, but I don't care. I want everyone to know that I was once their most loyal servant, and also their most trampled pawn. The recording continued, slowly but with suppressed anger. In the spring of 1994, Old Hawk found me and said there was a charity project that needed my help in managing accounts and documents. He said it was to help those poor patients. I believed him at the time. I even introduced my brother-in-law, Dr. Irene Carter, to join the foundation. I didn't expect that this was an elaborate scam. Aiden's eyes grew colder, and his mind quickly pieced together an outline: power, deception, betrayal. It wasn't until early 1995 that I discovered that the foundation was secretly funding a study on neurotoxins. The location was in a private laboratory outside Melbourne. The lead researcher was my brother-in-law's wife, Vivian Carter's sister, Dr. Irene. She was unaware of it, and her academic status was used. When I questioned Old Hawk, he just laughed. Roland Baker told me, "You are just someone who follows orders. You don't need to know too much." At that moment I realized that I was not a partner, not a collaborator. I was just their tool, a tool that could be discarded at any time. There was a pause in the recording for a few seconds, as if Albert was adjusting his mood. Then my son died. They accused him of stealing, which drove him and his wife to suicide. I know they did it on purpose. I have no evidence, but I know that all this is a reckoning before retribution. From that day on, I was no longer Albert Crane. I was just a shadow waiting for revenge. Aiden slowly closed his eyes, the deep words echoing in his ears. It took me 30 years to get to where I am today. There was dead silence in the room. Lucia's eyes were moist, and her lips were trembling slightly. She murmured, "Grandpa, he once believed in them, too." Ethan said softly, "This recording is enough to overturn the nature of the entire incident. This is not a case of inheritance dispute, but a revenge that lasted for 30 years. Aiden stood up, carefully took out the tape, and put it into the sealed bag he carried with him. His eyes were calm, but his heart was filled with complex emotions. And this game is not over yet. The next morning, before dawn, the manor was still shrouded in morning mist. Aiden handed a copy of the recording to Ethan, and whispered, "Release it as soon as possible. The sooner the better." Ethan nodded and turned to leave. His figure disappeared at the end of the manor corridor, and the sound of his footsteps gradually faded away. In the shadow of the woods in the distance, an unlicensed vehicle started quietly, its taillights flickering faintly. It began to keep up with Ethan's pace. At 6 in the morning, the air outside Melbourne was still freezing cold. Blackthorn Manor looms in the morning mist, like a sleeping ghost castle. Aiden stood in the hallway, put an old tape into a sealed bag, and handed it to Ethan Blair. "The sooner the better," he whispered. Ethan nodded, took the tape, turned around and walked out of the manor quickly, his footsteps sounding crisply on the cobblestone road. He is a freelance journalist who specializes in uncovering hidden truths. This recording is Albert Crane's personal account of the betrayal and revenge that happened 30 years ago. Once it is exposed, it will be enough to lift the veil of the entire Hawke family. However, just as he reached the gate of the manor, he noticed something strange. Deep in the woods in the distance, a black unlicensed car started quietly, with the lights not on but slowly caught up with his pace. Ethan frowned and quickly adjusted his route, bypassing a bush and turning onto the road leading to the city. As he walked, he pulled out his cell phone and sent Aiden a text message. "Someone is watching me." Aiden immediately responded, "Don't go home. Go to the subway station and get rid of them." Ethan quickened his pace, walked through an abandoned alley, and entered the subway entrance. He looked around and quickly bought a ticket to enter the station. The train roared towards him, and he jumped into the carriage, shuttling between the transfer passages, stopping, and then moving again. It was not until the third time he changed buses that he confirmed that the black car had completely disappeared. He breathed a sigh of relief and immediately contacted Aiden. The stalker has been shaken off, but someone doesn't want this recording to be made public. Meanwhile, on the other side, archivist Emily Watson is sitting at a computer in the municipal archives, her hands typing away at the keyboard. In front of her was an access interface to an encrypted database, with the title clearly reading Blackthorn Foundation Project Records. She just received a call from her superior. Suspend all access to files related to the Foundation. She knew what this meant. Someone wanted to seal this history, but she did not obey the order. On the contrary, she had already anticipated this day. As early as a few days ago, she began to secretly back up key data and compress and encrypt it. At this moment, she finished uploading the last batch of files, clicked the send button, and forwarded the information to Aiden. The body of the email only has one sentence: "Some history should not be forgotten, even if it is painful." Meanwhile, Aiden was sitting in the manor study, his laptop screen lit up and his mailbox beeping. He clicked on the attachment, unzipped the file, and quickly browsed the contents. As he read deeper, his brows furrowed more and more. A fund flowchart caught his attention. The Foundation's funds had flowed into the account of a company called Hermes Biotechnology many times, and the legal representative of this company was Roland Baker's personal lawyer, James Hudson. This is no ordinary inheritance dispute. This is a political corruption case involving illegal cross-border transactions. Aiden took a deep breath, closed his computer, picked up his windbreaker, and prepared to go out. He wanted to meet this so-called lawyer in person to find out how many unknown secrets were hidden behind this revenge that had lasted for 30 years. As night fell, the atmosphere in the manor became more solemn. In a private gallery in the city, Lillian Finch is making the final arrangements for an upcoming exhibition. In the center of the exhibition hall, portraits are neatly arranged, each carrying a strong emotional tension. The faces in the picture have different expressions. Some are angry, some are sad, and some are indifferent, but they all seem to be silently accusing. The exhibition title hangs high on the wall, "The Face of the Silent." Lillian stood at the end of the exhibition hall and whispered to herself, "Your voices will be heard eventually." Little did she know that this exhibition would become one of the keys to uncovering the ultimate secrets of Blackthorn Manor. And the night hasn't really begun yet. The gallery is brightly lit at night, and the air is filled with the scent of oil paint and champagne. Lillian Finch stood in the center of the exhibition hall, her eyes sweeping across familiar faces. Albert, Isabel, Alexander. Their portraits were revived by her brushstrokes, as if silently accusing the truths buried by the years. They are not bystanders of history. Her voice was calm and firm, attracting everyone's attention. They are the silent victims, whose voices are crushed by power. There was silence, followed by warm applause. People raised their phones to take pictures and spread the emotionally charged exhibition on social media. The faces of the silent quickly became a local hot search, and some people began to question the true purpose of the Blackthorn Foundation in the comments, and some even dug up the sensational land deed controversy from 30 years ago. Outside the crowd, a man in a dark windbreaker quietly left the scene and disappeared into the night. At the same time, in a remote bar on the other side of the city, Aidan Hawke pushed open the door. Under the dim light, James Hudson was already sitting in the corner, with a glass of whiskey in front of him, almost untouched. "You're here." James looked up, his tone somewhat unnaturally calm. Aidan sat down and unbuttoned his windbreaker. "If you really knew everything, why didn't you stop it?" The air seemed to freeze for a few seconds. James lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, "You think I don't know? I just can't change." He pulled a document from his briefcase and gently pushed it toward Aidan. "Here's what you wanted. The minutes of the Foundation's internal meeting." Aidan took it, stroking the cover with his fingers, and he already had the answer in his mind. "This is not evidence. It is a confession." The two looked at each other in silence for a moment, and suddenly there was a rapid sound of car brakes outside the bar, followed by the sound of glass breaking. James stood up suddenly. "They are coming." Aidan quickly stuffed the documents into the inner pocket of his coat, looked around, and found a path leading to the underground garage in the direction of the back door. He whispered, "Let's go. I have a car." James nodded and followed closely. As soon as the two men passed through the door curtain, several dark shadows rushed into the bar, moving in a well-trained manner and heading straight for the empty seats. Aidan and James had disappeared into the night. At this moment, in an encrypted server room far away in the city center, Ethan was sitting in front of the computer, typing on the keyboard rapidly with his hands. Next to him was an old recorder that was automatically uploading data. On the screen, an article title appeared, "The Judge Under the Blackthorn." The cursor flashes and the number of words continues to grow, but he also understood that someone would not let them live to see tomorrow. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Melbourne sky still carried the residual warmth of the night, and Ethan Blair's exclusive report, "The Judge Under the Blackthorns," was released on social platforms and news websites on time. Below the title is a deep and powerful introduction. 30 years ago, a land deed dispute took away a family's innocence. 30 years later, an old housekeeper completed the liquidation by accident. Today we uncover the true face of the Blackthorn Foundation. The article was accompanied by 3 key pieces of evidence: the full text of the tape in which Albert Klein personally narrated the entire incident, a chart of the Foundation's fund flows over the past decade, and medical records provided anonymously by Vivian Carter, which showed that Edward Hawke's blood did contain muscle relaxants before his death. Public opinion exploded instantly. Blackthorn scandal quickly became the #1 trending search. Citizens spontaneously went to the City Hall to petition for a thorough investigation of the Foundation. Major media outlets reprinted Ethan's report, and even international journalists called the city government to demand a response. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Roland Baker was forced to hold an emergency press conference. This former city council member, once hailed as a reform pioneer, now stood under the spotlight, his face grim and his tone vague. Faced with reporters' sharp questions, he repeatedly answered, "Under investigation," and inconvenient to comment, but he was unable to explain why more than 8 million of the Foundation's funds flowed into overseas offshore accounts. Finally, when a reporter asked him whether he had participated in covering up the land deed controversy 30 years ago, Roland Baker slammed his speech and announced, "I will temporarily step back to ensure that the judicial process is not interfered with." The crowd was in an uproar. Meanwhile, in a nondescript prosecutor's office outside Melbourne, Aidan Hawke gently placed a manila file bag on the table. "Here is all the evidence," he told the independent prosecutor sitting across from him, including the tapes, the money flow charts, the medical reports, and the on-site investigation notes. He left a handwritten letter on the back of the envelope. The debt from 30 years ago was finally paid off today. A witness. After leaving the office, he called Lucia Klein. The hearing will be held next week, he said. Your grandfather wanted the truth to be known, and it's up to you to do it. Lucia was silent for a moment, then asked softly, will you testify in court? I have done my part. Aiden's voice was as steady as usual, but you are different. You are the last card Albert left for this world. She finally agreed. That afternoon, Father Thomas took the initiative to contact Aiden. The two met in front of the church crypt where Albert's family were buried. I know what you are looking for. The priest took out a torn diary from the crevice and handed it to Aiden. It was an almost yellowed handwritten notebook, with a sentence written on the last page. If the truth comes out one day, please tell the world that I never gave up hope. After Aiden finished reading, he gently closed the notebook, and it seemed as if something in his heart had finally settled. Just as he was about to leave the church, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from James Hudson. I'm ready. I'll see you at the hearing. Aiden stared at the screen for a few seconds, the corners of his mouth slightly raised. He didn't reply, but put his phone back in his pocket and walked towards the street in the dusk. In the distance, the sun is slowly sinking into the skyline, as if putting an end to a dusty history. But in a certain corner, someone clenched his fists and whispered, they thought it was over? No. It's just the beginning. Chapter 19. Before dawn. On the day of the hearing, there was already a huge crowd outside the court. Media cameras were set up on both sides of the steps, and flashlights rained down. Roland Baker sat in the dock, wearing a neat suit, but looking tense. His legal team tried to dismiss the charges on the grounds of unclear source of evidence, but all struggles were in vain the moment James Hudson took the witness stand. James, former head of the Melbourne Police Archives and the only police officer who was not bribed in the land deed case, restored the truth of the conspiracy 30 years ago, word by word in a calm but firm voice. I found a forged copy of the deed in the archives, signed by Edward Hawke and the local judge at the time. The original was later replaced, and the fake document eventually became the key evidence in the theft charge against Albert's son. He paused for a moment and pulled a yellowed envelope from his briefcase. This is a copy of the original deed that I secretly kept. It has never appeared in the official records. The courtroom fell into deathly silence. The judge looked around the room, and his eyes fell on the prosecutor. Please list this document as key evidence. As the gavel fell heavily, Roland's face turned pale as paper in an instant. He knew that he had no way out. When the judge announced the launch of a criminal investigation, a slight sob was heard in the gallery. Aiden looked towards the source of the voice. Lucia Klein was sitting in the first row, her hands tightly gripping the armrests of her seat. Tears in her eyes, but the corners of her mouth slightly raised. There was no hatred in her eyes, only relief. That was the last lesson Albert left her. Justice may be late, but it is never absent. As night fell, news of the hearing's end spread across the country. The Blackthorn Foundation has officially frozen its operations, and the relevant responsible persons have been restricted from leaving the country, pending further investigation. But Aiden did not attend any celebration party or media interviews. He drove back to the ruins of the manor alone, and stopped in front of the cracked antique mirror. The wind blew through the broken window frames, raising dust and thorn petals. The moonlight cast a silver glow, illuminating his tired but clear figure. He gently brushed away the dust on the mirror, looked at his reflection, and whispered, "You win, Albert." As if in response to these words, the thorn flowers in the distance swayed gently in the night breeze. Like a whisper, he turned and left, and the dawn began to appear behind him. A new era was quietly approaching. On the other side of the city, the first rays of morning sunlight penetrated through the hotel window and gently sprinkled on Aiden's mailbox. An unsigned letter lay quietly in it. Attached was a copy of a handwritten will, signed by Albert Klein. Date, 1 week before arrest. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the hotel on the outskirts of Melbourne was still immersed in a grey-blue silence. The only sound on the street was the low hum of an occasional tram, an echo from another world. When Aidan Hawke pushed open the door, the sunlight was slanting through the window at the end of the corridor, casting mottled shadows on the carpet. He did not sleep well last night. In his dream he saw Albert's hunched figure, and the whispered words, "Justice may be late, but it is never absent." He walked towards the mailbox, and the moment his fingertips touched the envelope, his heart beat inexplicably faster. There is no signature or postmark. The paper was slightly yellowed and the edges were curled, obviously caused by being folded many times after being handwritten. Aidan returned to the room, closed the door, and slowly unfolded the letter. The signature was clearly written as Albert Crane. The date was a week before his arrest, and before he was last seen in public. The content is short but meaningful. I left behind an unregistered asset, a property called Whitethorn Villa outside Melbourne. It can only be opened by the bloodline heir and witnesses. Aidan frowned. He recalled never having heard of the location during the investigation of the case. Blackthorn Manor is mysterious enough. Does Albert have other plans? Just as he was thinking, there was a knock on the door. Standing outside the door was Charles Mason, a young legal assistant, with a pale face and sweat on his forehead. Aidan, I found this in the office archives. He handed over a document. It's secret information that Albert entrusted me to keep before he died. He said he would give it to you if anything unexpected happened. Aidan took it and opened the cover. Inside was a coded diary fragment. The handwriting was old and neat, revealing a hint of urgency. Whitethorn is not a refuge, but a place where the truth is recorded. There is a book of the judge hidden there, which will tell you everything. Aidan looked up at Charles, his eyes sharp as a knife. Do you know what this is? Charles shook his head. I don't know the specific content, but Albert said that this book is more important than his life. Aidan was silent for a moment and called Lucia. She answered the call quickly, her voice full of excitement and anxiety. Did you receive anything too? She asked. Aidan responded briefly. A copy of Albert's will. It mentions a place called Whitethorn Villa. There was a slight gasp from the other end of the line. My grandfather did mention this place, Lucia said in a low voice. He also said something that I have always remembered. There is a book there that records everyone's sins, if it really exists. That is his final testimony. Half an hour later, Aidan had driven to the outskirts of the city. Lucia sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed forward. The scenery along the way became increasingly desolate, and the shadows of the trees lengthened, as if time was also swallowed up by this silent land. Do you think there is anyone here? She suddenly asked. If there is, Aidan said calmly, it must not be a living person. The car drove into a dense forest path, and the outline of a solitary stone building could be vaguely seen in the distance. Whitethorn Villa. The outer wall was mottled and covered with vines. Above the door hung a rusty iron plate with a few blurry letters engraved on it. The two got out of the car, and the air was filled with the smell of damp soil and dead leaves. I remember my grandfather said that the book of the judge is not hidden in a safe, but in a place that is most easily overlooked, Lucia whispered. They entered the villa, and the door creaked harshly on its hinges. The house had been covered in dust for a long time, and the furniture was covered with white cloth, standing quietly like ghosts. Aidan looked around, his eyes scanning every corner sharply. The study became their first target. The books on the shelves were neatly arranged, but not dusty, and it was obvious that the place had been cleaned regularly. They paused in front of the fireplace. Lucia reached out and gently pushed one side of the brick wall, and suddenly, a slight clicking sound was heard. The brick was slightly concave, revealing a gap as thick as a finger. Aidan squatted down and gently pried the mechanism with the key. Click. With a slight sound, the wall slowly slid open, revealing a secret compartment embedded in the wall. They both held their breath. In the darkness, a notebook with a black cover lay quietly. Aidan reached out and took it out, brushed off the dust, and opened the title page. A line of handwritten words appeared before my eyes. To the future reckoners. The air seemed to freeze at this moment. Lucia looked at the notebook and whispered, "We found it." Aidan said nothing, but closed the book with a heavy look in his eyes. The real storm has just begun. As night falls, Whitethorn Villa becomes even more eerie in the twilight. The wind blew through the forest, causing the vines to sway gently, as if someone was whispering. Aidan Hawke sat at the worn wooden table in the study, a black notebook open in front of him, the words on the first page still echoing on his retina. "When the thorns bloom on the seventh day, the silent ones will awaken." His heart was shaken. This was not a simple last words, but some kind of prophetic statement. Albert Crane, the old butler who seemed to be a loyal servant but actually harbored a burning flame of revenge, had actually foreseen the fate of this reckoning, even that he would be the reckoner. Lucia stood by the window, alert, her eyes occasionally glancing at the dark woods outside. Her grandfather once said that some secrets once opened can never be closed again. "This book records more than just the truth," she whispered. "It's like a judgment book." Aidan didn't answer but carefully scanned the notebook into his tablet, preparing to send it to Ethan Blair. The investigative reporter might be able to find more hidden information in the text. He made another call. "Father Thomas, I need you to help translate some German passages. It may be related to an unjust case. 30 years ago." The call was brief and efficient, and the priest promised to come as soon as possible. As time slowly passed, the sound of the wind outside the house became clearer, as if someone was whispering. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke the silence, abrupt and harsh. Lucia became alert instantly, walked slowly to the door, and looked out through the gap in the curtains. An elderly woman stood at the door, her hair as white as snow, and she was wearing an old but neat dark robe. She held a copper key in her hand. Her eyes were calm, but sharp enough to see through everything. "I'm Margaret Carter," the woman began, her voice hoarse but firm. "I know what you're looking for." The air in the room seemed to suddenly freeze. Lucia looked back at Aidan with a questioning look in her eyes. Aidan nodded slightly, stood up and walked to the door, slowly unlocking it. The door opened and Margaret stepped into the room. Her eyes swept around and finally fell on the open black notebook. Her expression became complicated. It was as if that long-forgotten memory was slowly awakening before her eyes. The first ray of sunlight in the morning shines into the study through the gaps in the thick curtains, and dust floats slowly in the beam of light. Lucia stood by the window with a tense look in her eyes. Aidan sat at the table, stroking the black notebook with his fingertips as if he was touching something taboo. Margaret Carter sat down slowly, her eyes falling on the old book with a thorn pattern engraved on the cover. Her expression was complicated, as if she had traveled through 30 years. 30 years ago, I knew that this thing would reappear in the world sooner or later. Her voice was low and hoarse, with the calmness and heaviness of the years. At that time, Albert was still a loyal and almost paranoid servant. He was almost blind to the Hawke family. Aidan flipped through the yellowed pages of the judge's book. Each page was like a dusty accusation, recording how old Hawke used his power to force the housekeeper's son to death, forged evidence, manipulated public opinion, and even used the legal machinery to push an innocent family into the abyss. But what is most shocking is that the book not only records in detail the true identities of Roland Baker, the prodigal son, Lillian Finch the artist, and others, but also the complete plan of their death, including the methods, psychological induction, and even details of the on-site arrangement. "He's not a madman who kills randomly," Aidan whispered, his finger gently running over a piece of text. "He has a target. Every victim is related to the incident that year." In the margin of one page he wrote, "Justice is not punishment, but giving voice to the voiceless." Lucia read her grandfather's handwriting with tears in her eyes. She pointed to one of the passages and said, "Look here. If one day I can't go on, I hope someone will finish this journey for me." Aidan looked down, and his heartbeat suddenly became slow and clear. Those words did not seem to be written for the future murderer, but a revelation for the successors.
He wants me to be his liquidator?
Aidan murmured to himself, with an unprecedented chill in his heart.
No.
Lucia shook her head. He just hopes that someone can see the buried facts. Do you understand? He doesn't want to kill anyone. He just wants people to remember him. Margaret finally spoke up. The injustice that happened back then was not just Hawke's fault. The lawyer forged the title deed. The prodigal son fanned the flames, and the doctor knew about it, but chose to remain silent. Albert has neither forgotten nor forgiven. Aidan closed his notebook and was silent for a long time. He spent 30 years planning this, he said. From arranging the will to designing each death scene, he made everyone die in the scene they were most familiar with. This is not revenge. This is judgment. Margaret nodded slightly. Do you know why he always calls this book the Book of Judge? Because he knows that one day, someone will open it and see the hidden truth. Outside the window, the morning mist had not yet dissipated, and the manor was still as gloomy as before. Ethan Blair's phone rang at this time. Aidan answered the phone, said a few brief words, hung up, and sent the scanned information over. After the call ended, he looked at Lucia and said, "The media will get involved. The storm will soon sweep across Melbourne." Lucia looked at the black notebook and whispered, "What about us?" Aidan stood up, put on his coat, and looked determined. "Let's solve the rest of the puzzle." As the night faded, Blackthorn Manor welcomed the dawn of the 7th day. The wind blew through the woods, as if someone was whispering, "When the thorns bloom on the 7th day, the silent ones will awaken." And this book is waiting for its next reader. Ethan Blair stayed awake all night after receiving the scan data sent by Aidan. At 6 o'clock in the morning, he typed the title of the report that was enough to shock the whole of Melbourne. The Book of the Judge, Albert's last words. The article, written in a cold yet warm tone, makes public the truth of the 7-day murder case at Blackthorn Manor, and reveals for the first time the tragedy of how the son of the butler, Albert Klein, was framed. His wife and children were separated, and finally both mother and son died 30 years ago. Attached to this article are some excerpts and analysis from the Book of the Judge. Between the lines, one can hear an old man whispering in the middle of the night, "I only ask you to remember." This report was like a stone sinking into the center of a lake, causing ripples. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the online hot search list was dominated by terms such as Albert's suicide note and the Book of the Judge exposed. On social media platforms, some people cried for Albert's revenge, while others condemned his extreme methods. But more people began to reflect on that forgotten past and question how justice should be defined. Meanwhile, Lillian Finch has a special exhibition at the gallery downtown called Shapes of Memory. She mounted and exhibited the manuscript copies of the Book of the Judge that she had obtained from Aidan, and wrote the captions herself. This is not revenge, but the continuation of memory. Some stories should not be forgotten, and some silences must be broken. The lighting in the exhibition hall was soft, and the audience stood quietly. Many people stopped for a long time with red eyes. Someone wrote on the message wall, "Thank you for letting us see them." Another person drew a thorn flower on a card. On the other side of the city, night fell quietly. Aidan sat alone on the balcony of Whitethorn Villa, gently stroking the black notebook in his hand. The wind blew through the thorn bushes outside the courtyard, making a slight rustling sound as if it was Albert's last sigh. He closed the book and whispered, "Thank you, Albert. I'll keep going." The words floated into the night, without an echo, but with a firm power. In the distance, the city lights lit up one after another, and next to this ancient manor, an old dream was finally awakened. The next morning, The sun shone on the terrace of Whitethorn Villa. Aidan gathered Lucia, Margaret and Ethan for a final meeting in the living room. He slowly opened the notebook in his hand and glanced at the three people. I think we should do something to make these truths truly live. His tone was firm and his eyes were clear, as if he had made some important decision. That decision is hidden in the book of the judge, which will soon be donated to the National Archives. In the early morning, Whitethorn Villa is gently awakened by the sunshine. Aidan stood in the middle of the living room, holding the black notebook with a worn cover. There was still a hint of chill from last night's wind, but the warm light of the fireplace was already burning in the house. Lucia Klein sat on the edge of the sofa, her expression complicated and determined. Margaret Carter leaned against the window, flipping through a document in her hand. It was the annotated version of the book of the judge that Aidan had compiled overnight. It not only recorded the original text of Albert Crane's manuscript, but also detailed the timeline, character relationships, and key evidence. Ethan Blair leaned against the dining table, holding a mobile phone in his hand. On the screen was the latest news. The truth about Blackthorn Manor is exposed, and the public is hotly discussing the boundary between revenge and justice. We've done what we had to do, Aidan said, his voice low but clear. Now we have to make sure it's not forgotten. He placed his notebook on the table and glanced at the three people in turn. I have decided to donate the Inquisitor's book to the National Historical Archives, along with my annotated version. This is not a secret, but a warning. We must make people remember how a family was destroyed by greed and indifference that night 30 years ago. Lucia nodded slightly, a gleam in her eyes. She took the copy and carefully placed it in her suitcase. I will travel with it, she said, her voice soft but firm. To Europe, to America, to let more people know their stories. Maybe one day, I can write a book of judges belonging to our generation. Margaret sighed and put down the documents in her hand. You are a brave man, Aidan, she said slowly. But I must remind you of something. Her tone suddenly became serious. You thought the end of this incident was Albert's death, but in fact there is still one person who has never really stood up to face the past. Aidan frowned slightly. You mean James Hudson? Margaret nodded. He was the only one who knew the whole story, but chose to remain silent. He was not an accomplice, but he did not prevent the tragedy from happening. If you really want to end this, you have to find him. The air seemed to freeze in an instant. Ethan looked up at Aidan. What are you going to do? He asked. Aidan pondered for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'm gonna make another visit. His tone was calm, yet it carried a certain unquestionable power. In the afternoon, the sun shines through the clouds outside an old cafe in the center of Melbourne. Aidan drove alone through the city streets. Along the way there were tall buildings and a modern atmosphere, but it could not hide the heavy historical echoes in his heart. He stopped the car, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. In the corner of the cafe, an old man in a grey suit had been waiting for a long time. James Hudson, a former police veteran and now a city government consultant, is the last person to have not been held accountable for that injustice. He looked up and saw Aidan, with a vague smile on his face. I knew you would come, he said. You always do this. You won't let go. Aidan sat down across from him and ordered a cup of black coffee. I'm not here to question you, he said, his voice as calm as water. I just want you to understand one thing. He paused, looking the other person straight in the eye.
You're not a bad guy, but you're not a hero either. Now it's your turn to make a choice.
James's expression finally changed. He slowly put down the spoon in his hand, and for the first time there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. Outside the window the wind blew the curtains, as if taking away something, and also seemed to bring something, and Aidan just sat there quietly, waiting, like the silence before a storm. The door of the cafe slowly closed behind him, and the wind chimes rang softly, as if bidding farewell to an era. The streets were still immersed in the quietness before dawn. The sky in the distance was a faint grey blue, and the city had not yet fully awakened. Aidan walked alone on the sidewalk, his steps steady but with a hint of fatigue. It was not physical fatigue, but the heaviness of the soul, after being repeatedly washed by the truth. When I returned to Whitethorn Villa, the morning light was quietly falling on the stone path in the courtyard. Lucia had left and Margaret had returned to the city. Aidan was the only one left in the room, along with the original manuscript of the Book of the Judge on the living room table. He stood at the door and looked back at the building that had been silent for many years. It was once a symbol of power and lies, but now it has become a witness to memory. The wind blew through the courtyard, and the thorn flowers swayed slightly in the morning light, like a silent consolation. "It's over," he whispered. As I took a step toward leaving, my phone vibrated. Ethan's message pops up. The news has been released. The title is The Final Chapter of The Silent One. Aidan stared at the screen for a few seconds, a faint smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. He knew that this was not the end, but a beginning. Justice may be late, but it will never be absent. However, just as he was about to put his phone back in his pocket, another message popped up from an anonymous number. "Do you think you have uncovered all the truth? There are still shadows behind the Blackthorn Foundation. They are still watching you." Aidan's pupils shrank slightly, and his fingertips tightened. He quickly glanced around. The streets were empty in the early morning. Only a crow flapped its wings and flew away from a dead tree in the distance, breaking the silence. He didn't reply, but locked his phone and walked quickly to the car. Inside the car, he started the engine and looked straight ahead through the windshield. In the rearview mirror, Whitethorn Villa gradually disappeared at the end of the field of vision, and in his mind, the internal memo that James had given him was turning over. Internal memo regarding higher-level political involvement with the Blackthorn Foundation. This is not just a revenge settlement, but also the tip of the iceberg of power play. Even as night falls, the storm is still brewing. The real trial has just begun. That's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. Have a good sleep. Good night, dear wanderer.